All right. I think we'll wait just one more moment for Commissioner Lanier. I think I hear her. Oh, good. All right. Good, good, good. Yeah, please see if she's... Great. Hey, no, you're fine. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our City Commission meeting on this May 3rd of 2022. Today's an important day as our city manager presents his fiscal plan to this body. So just a couple things as we prepare for our time together this morning. I will first turn it over to our city manager to do a presentation of the proposed budget. And then commissioners, we do have two resolutions before us, and these are just simple resolutions to schedule public hearings on May 17th for two items related to the budget. But just a couple of things. The city manager will break up the presentation into three sections. And so I'll ask you to hold your questions and comments until we get to those breaks, just to give staff time to get through the materials. And then I'm sure, like many of you, I haven't had a chance to read the entire budget just yet. I'll be working through that over the next week. As you do that, because of the compressed timeline that we have for a whole host of reasons, I'm going to ask you to send any questions or comments you have as you read through the budget directly to the city manager, and so that he can get our feedback even in real time, I'd say, before our meetings over the next several weeks. So if you'll join me in doing that, I know he'll appreciate it. You're welcome, obviously, to CC our CFO, but it's important that as soon as you have questions or comments that you get those to him so that he can prepare for the meetings that we have over the next couple weeks. So with that, welcome everyone. I'll turn it over to our city manager to present our budget.
Thank you, Mayor Bliss, and good morning, commissioners. I want to thank you for this opportunity this morning to share the proposed fiscal 23 budget with you. And I want to begin by thanking all the staff that has worked so hard to make this possible, and I'll acknowledge them more in detail later in the presentation. But as I reflected on this morning, this is my fourth budget proposal, and three of the budget proposals have occurred since the pandemic, with economic turmoil and social unrest. And this one is similar to the conditions of the other budget proposals, but with a little more nuance, as when we began preparing this process with you back in November and considering some of the policy issues we'll talk about today, we had no idea we would also be challenged with a real public safety issue that involved one of our own police officers in the shooting of Patrick Leoya on April the 4th. And so this budget recognizes a lot of the conversation that is occurring now around public safety reform, but it also recognizes the need to continue essential services and also provide improvements in areas that you've talked about previously. So this morning, what I'd like to do is, as we introduce the proposed budget, talk about those areas in which we will continue to provide essential services, but I'll highlight some of the changes as well as continuing to place emphasis on the important work of equity that we started with the adoption of our strategic plan and being intentional about addressing institutional and systematic racism that has plagued this community and organization in the past. The proposed budget is almost $600 million of all funds and $163 million for the general fund. We continue to use our strategic plan as a roadmap. There's also a 2% reduction in the property tax rate millage, but we are fortunate to leverage the use of ARPA funds, and as you'll see later on, highlighted in the spending plan, about $32 million is planned for use fiscal year 23. We also wanted to make sure that we continue to provide all the essential services around road maintenance, water quality, make sure the parks are maintained, but also, as I mentioned, pay particular attention to the need to increase our level of trust in reform when it comes to public safety, specifically law enforcement, and you'll see a significant increase in investment in our Office of Public Safety and Oversight. This is the first conversation we'll have today. We'll continue the discussion on the 10th, both in the morning and in the afternoon, and you'll see the topics that we'll cover during our workshops. If there's time, either on the morning of the 10th or the afternoon of the 10th or the 17th, although we're scheduled for a public hearing, if there's a need to continue to discuss any of the topics that you have heard, we'll also provide time there as well as on the 24th prior to your vote. I mentioned the importance of continuing to align the organization with our vision, our mission, and our values, as these are central, and you'll hear them referenced throughout the budget discussions, as well as the focus on making sure that we continue to make progress on our 6 strategic priorities. And that is how the briefings are organized around our priority areas. Additionally, if you recall, when we conducted the retreat, there were areas of specific focus during the pandemic, the recession, as well as helping us to improve our relationship with community around social tension. And today we will discuss 3 of those areas of focus after I provide a general overview of the budget: public safety reform, crime prevention, and fiscal sustainability. So you'll hear after I present the CFO, Ms. Stout, on equity, we'll take a pause, then we'll hear from our police chief, our oversight office, and take a pause, and then we'll hear from the fire chief as well as 61st District Court. So some highlights of some safe community investments. I mentioned the investments from the Oversight Office. The budget there was previously $405,000. In this year's proposed budget, there will be over $2.5 million of resources in the Oversight Office. Some will be specifically designated for community informed and community engaged cultural competency training and de-escalation training. This is in addition to the training that the police department has in their budget. I'm expecting the Oversight Office to engage both the police department and the community, so this training is co-designed, co-experienced with community members to focus on the topics around competency and de-escalation. There's additional staffing in the Oversight Office. We've also reallocated the funding for the body cam contract to the Oversight Office for the administration of the contract. So it's not atypical for other cities to have the contractual terms and conditions of the contract negotiated by the procurement office, IT department, or entity outside of the department, where the police department still operationally utilizes and manages it, but we're elevating the administration of it for additional transparency and oversight to the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. We also have funding for the continuation of the Cure Violence program, almost $900,000, and some of that is from a variety of sources, both grant funding as well as the federal funding you'll hear highlighted in our legislative effort that we appreciate our representatives helping us to acquire. We've also specifically carved out funding for $150,000 to increase our engagement efforts with our immigrant and refugee community. We've heard the need to be more intentional around engaging those members of our community to make sure that they understand their rights as immigrant and refugees, as well as some of the systems that are in place that may be somewhat unfamiliar to them, and helping them to make sure they feel connected and belonging in our community. And you'll see some of the other efforts, much of the good work you'll hear from Mr. Davis later. We also have additional $1 million in crime prevention, violence prevention programs, the continuation, a lot of good work from our neighborhood organizations. As actually we've increased the funding to neighborhoods, you'll hear later on, by 25% with some of the CDBG funded programs, and we're continuing the work of the SAFE Task Force. Some other examples of efforts that we're making to enhance safe community investments include our mobile crisis police co-response partnership with Network 180. We've been successful in piloting a partnership with them in domestic assault response units, as well as the homeless outreach team. And so we're expanding the types of calls that they will be assisting with, and you'll see the other efforts around both police and fire, and I won't go into detail. I'll let the police chief and fire chief highlight that as well. But I do want to highlight the fire department's $100,000 fire cadet program that they're launching this year to enhance diversity and inclusion within the fire department. Around governmental excellence, last year we launched the Participatory Budgeting program. Unfortunately, that was launched last year. That program is not, the funds have not been expended. And so I heard from some of the commissioners who were very pleased to hear that there was $1 million in the third ward, but none of it has been executed. So we are going to reinstitute the funding for the Third Ward Equity Fund to its previous amount of $750,000. That's in addition to the money that's in the participatory budgeting process. You see the intentionality around supporting the work of equity staff in the department due to grant funding, as well as some other efforts to ensure that we have good continuity of leadership, specifically in our HR department. We're going to fully fund the assistant director position this year, as well as begin our efforts in updating our compensation study now that we are finding ourselves in an even more competitive market in the future, as well as continuing our efforts around innovation and continuous improvement with our newly staffed innovation officer. I also want to call to your attention the $300,000 investment that we will have in our facility space and utilization workspace analysis. We're basically going to look at all city-owned properties and make sure that we are continuing to use them in their best and most appropriate use, similar to what we've done with 201, but we're going to have that analysis citywide in all of our properties that we own. Continuing in economic prosperity and affordability investment, you'll see the reallocation of $5 million from the for the Affordable Housing Fund, additional investments for housing and homelessness, another $6 million roughly for those services, as well as our continuation of our material storage program that we have for particularly for those unhoused persons who did not feel comfortable going into sheltering locations, or even if they did, particularly during the daytime, they have somewhere to store their materials in a safe place, and we found that to be a good pilot. You'll also see several other investments around projects, the continuation of the discussion and funding for the master plan, and several other initiatives along the river corridor, but also our support of developing minority-owned business programs, and what we hope for will ultimately leverage an additional $10 million in private commitments based on the incentives that we have offered through the city's tax incentive programs. I do want to call your attention to another new investment, a $50,000 investment that we will be making with the support of the Black Business Expo and African American Task Force to help us convene business owners, not only in our African American community, but the diaspora, if you will, of the Black community, to begin to talk about a more synergetic conversation around business development. How do we become more supportive of those opportunities? I know we'll hear later on about some of our economic service organizations that we have, but there's a need to have a broader organization or a conversation to help us with that, and we're happy to be part of that dialogue and discussions, particularly as members of our community are starting to document the legacy and history of the plight of African Americans in Grand Rapids. We want to be part of the conversation. You'll see investments under engaged and connected community, and we'll have more discussion talking about how we want to be more deliberate around our engagement efforts. We've talked about before the difference between communication and engagement. You'll see $200,000 for the creation of that framework. Also, I mentioned earlier the increased funding for our neighborhood organizations. That was about a 25% increase on average, as well as the intentional effort that I mentioned the Oversight Office will be doing with our immigrant community. Also want to highlight some of the efforts that the good work that the city clerk's doing in the bilingual communications and outreach strategy. That'll be new this year, as well as we've doubled our funding for our language access support and translation services in this year's budget, as we find that not only do we have to be bilingual in terms of helping people speak English and Spanish, but we're recognizing that there are additional languages that we need to ensure that there is competency on the city's staff whenever we're having public meetings and conversations with community members. We continue to double down on our efforts for climate action and climate adaptation, both focusing on reducing carbon emissions in buildings, as well as working with our neighborhood organizations to be more intentional, particularly with residents of color, and making sure that we can reduce carbon emissions. Also want to point out an electrification effort in the Parks Department that will convert all gas golf carts this year to, in the coming year, to electric golf carts. Some additional efforts that I'd like to highlight in terms of health and environment is both the support of some of our park and community spaces. You see the development and planning efforts for the Martin Luther King Park Lodge, Garfield Park, Richmond Park, and other centers in our community, as well as we are putting forth $1.3 million in funding for tree planting, as well as continuing our youth engagement programs, both for summer camps as well as outdoor activities. Some additional highlights of investments. And you can tell Allison helped to prepare these slides. There are more investments highlighting health and environment than any other section. We are spending $2.4 million to help convert some of the residents who are in our water system outside of the city who are on water wells to the city's water and sewer services, and make sure that they reduce exposure to PFAS. We also are continuing to pilot a $160,000 recycling pilot with properties owned by the Housing Commission, so multifamily recycling. And we're also being intentional about creating a new public education specialist, our public service aide, and our refuse collection operations to help us with recycling. And when I met with the staff and asked whose responsibility is it to focus on resident education around recycling full-time, all the time, 365 days a year, there was not a single person. It was a shared responsibility in the department. And we think we can be a little bit more intentional by having a person dedicated to that, similar to how we're continuing to have a person dedicated to lead hazard and control. Under mobility, we are continuing to expand our sidewalk network and trail network, as well as piloting a new program this year, $250,000 for our neighborhoods of focus to help with car share programs. So we had the bike share, the scooter program, and this year we'll be piloting a new car share program that would allow them to have additional mobility options, but locating it specifically in the neighborhoods of focus where we know that they're most transportation challenged, as well as additional funding of $100,000 in our equity-based transportation pass to help people to more equitably access some of those micro-mobility programs. And you'll hear later on about one of the benefits of ARPA. It's helped us with revenue replacement. Initially, when we started talking about need for revenue replacement, it was primarily because of income tax loss, but we have also seen from the pandemic the loss of revenue from parking, particularly with the lack of activation during much of the pandemic. But we're slowly seeing some recovery, but there is some needed need to stabilize the parking fund. We'll also have to have intentional conversations around our ridership with the DASH, as we are right now about a third of what the ridership was prior to the pandemic. The micro-mobility usage is significantly increased, but the DASH ridership has decreased. I do want to thank, again, the team. These are only some, but it really takes the entire organization, all the department directors that are here to really help us lead this effort. I do appreciate the work of my executive office, all of them in their effort, and particularly the fiscal services staff, who have, it seems like every year we prepare a budget and if something happens, we have to readjust the budget prior to presentation, and they have been very flexible and agile, as well as our communications office who's been helping us throughout this. And it's because of them that we're able to continue to achieve things not as just an organization, but also with the partnership of our community members to make sure that we improve the quality of life in our community. We'll transition real briefly to the financial plan, fiscal plan, and I'll have our CFO talk to us. But I just want you to, again, appreciate the process, that this is something does not happen overnight. We'll need to share, we didn't have time this morning, but the pictorial process that we created, or the video that we created about the process that talks about all the intentionality of the feedback that you provide, the feedback that we get from some of our commissions, the conversations that we hear even on the nights of city commission meetings that help to inform the budget recommendations. And this is in light of doing everything in the midst of economic uncertainties, recovering from the pandemic, but we are pleased that we've been able to maintain a strong bond rating and have not reduced any service levels. And with all of the uncertainty, we're very appreciative of the ARPA funds that help to provide some economic relief, but also some of the additional state and federal funding that has been leveraged. And I've listed some of those, and we appreciate our legislative team and their advocacy in helping us with this effort, both state and federal funding. You see several of the projects that are listed there, as well as the recent discussions that we've had around how to improve public safety reform. We know that this is not just a local initiative only, that there has to be change that occurs at the state and the federal area, federal level around policy that helps us to ensure that we're transparent and inclusive in terms of policing. These are some of the additional policy efforts that they're working on now, and we will be happy to discuss where we are on these as we proceed with some of the work sessions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our CFO, Ms. Claren. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. We'll start out just by talking about the fiscal plan. Hopefully you've all, I don't expect you to have read it. That's impressive, Mayor, if you've gotten through a good portion of it, only having it for 24 hours. But this is our fiscal plan. We break it down, as you can see on the slide, in these major areas. So it starts out with the manager's letter, and this is a great overview of our intentionality with the budget, where we're focusing spending on, lifting up those priorities, and where we think we're heading in the next 5 years. So then we get into a section called Budget Basics, and we have these all tabbed out for you. That is a great highlight, and I say this just for the public's interest as well. The guidelines we have when putting together the budget, it gives a good revenue overview, commentary on expenditures, and of course we lift up the strategic plan. We have the budget sliced and diced in different ways, by fund as well as by department. We have a section on grants, as well as the authority budgets. And in the appendices, you'll find more information on personnel, revenue, detail, things like that.
And Ms. Claire, let me, I forgot to emphasize to the commission, all the presenters, we did, even though there's lots of slides, we will not be going over every bullet on every slide, just the highlights.
Yep. Yeah, of course. Moving on to the financial highlights, as far as our revenue picture, from when I last saw you presented for you at mid-year, we were thinking we're going to land around 6% for our income tax. That picture has improved. We're looking at 8% right now for our fiscal year 22 forecast. This also includes $14.5 million of revenue replacement we plan to allocate directly to the general fund. And then we have, been watching mobile GR and the parking revenues. They're continuing to lag, so trying to get, help to them with revenue replacement as well. I am doing the application actually this week for the next tranche of the ARPA revenue. As you recall, we received half of it last May, so we expect to receive, I believe when I put the application in last year, we received that payment within 2 weeks, so expect to get it sometime during May. And as far as our pension funding, the general pension and police and fire are sitting at 79% and 78% respectively, with OPEB at 86%. This slide just gives an overview of some of the building blocks we think about when putting together the budget. One thing that is different this year is we did allocate a little bit more towards contingency, because as you recall, at mid-year we talked about supply chain shock going on, hard to get goods in the door that we're looking for, as well as inflation that's affecting pricing. So we are adding a bit more cushion this year, just to be conservative, and we'll see what happens. The other two graphs show our policy level spending. We want to keep our fund balance at 15% as a percent of general fund expenditures. With the impact of that ARPA revenue replacement, we're looking at 34.5%. For fiscal year 23 and the Budget Stabilization Fund, obviously we haven't contributed to the Budget Stabilization Fund, so that percentage, while we still have about $14.3 million in there, it's continuing to go down as expenditures rise. Our next slide is just our budgeting standards. These are you're fairly familiar with. We do contribute at 100% of our computed the actuarial computed employer contributions for the pension, the retiree healthcare system, and we do graphically show the two maintenance of efforts commitments we have at the city. The top graph is of the MO, maintenance of effort for the parks. You can see that rising. It rises and falls with the movement of the general fund. So that's what's going on there. And then we have the Vital Streets contribution of $13 million over 15 years. As you recall, in fiscal year 21, they had to make a large bullet payment for debt service, so we front-loaded their annual contribution. That's why you see it go to zero in 22 through 24, but then we get back up to their regular funding level at 25 onward. Next, just an overview of our staffing history since 2002. You can see as you go across, while we have made staffing reductions relative to the growth of city population, we're at a ratio about 0.84 today compared to where we were back in 2002. Just briefly on the OPEB system, as I mentioned, we're 86% funded with an unfunded liability of nearly $13 million. A lot of that progress we've made since 2005 is attributed to 28% of the employees. That's who's left in the defined benefit program, while we have people transitioning into that defined contribution. This is, showing that graphically how we are able to, close the gap between our actuarial liabilities compared to those assets. And then with the pension system, I briefly discussed this before, but here's showing that picture graphically as well. Here's the general system, and then the police and fire. So moving on to our revenues. This is citywide revenues. So you'll see the largest piece of pie there is our charges for services. That's so large because remember that includes our enterprises. So water, sewer, refuse, parking, all of those guys are in that big piece of pie there. Whereas the next one is the city income tax. So as you know, if you look at income tax, this is divided among the general fund, capital reserve, vital streets, and sidewalk repair. And as you know, it is the main engine for the general fund. This is just a view of showing how our property tax is used throughout the city. For every dollar of property tax, you can see it split up. So 29 cents of every dollar goes towards the general fund, followed by the library. Then we have the refuse fund, capital improvement fund, and the smallest piece is the parks fund. This is an updated view of our American Rescue Plan Act spending plan. This looks slightly different from what I showed you at mid-year because as city manager noted about the participatory budgeting, for example, we've been in the design phase on a lot of these areas. We expect more implementation and spending in the next year as we've really honed in on what's going on in each of these project areas and the best means of rollout. So the top section shows our plan for revenue replacement. Currently, we're going across the general fund, mobile GR, and 61st District Court. We did leave a allocation in there for other funds should we need to use it. And then the bottom section shows the same areas we've discussed before at mid-year. But again, I'm just noting that we did roll forward some of those categories just based on where they were at with their spending. Moving on to the 5x5. So as I've mentioned before, for fiscal year 21, we ended the year at 31.5% unassigned fund balance as a percent of expenditures. You can see fiscal year 22, we were, in fiscal year 21, remember, we were being propped up by the CARES dollars. That's why you see that other revenues category at $59.3 million. That includes, I think, roughly 13 million of CARES for that year. So usually that other revenue category falls around 44, 45 million. In 22, you can see now we transition over into that ARPA funding being put to work. So that's going across the forecast between fiscal year 22 and 24. It's gonna, because we are using that results in us anticipating a surplus in fiscal year 22. And then as you can see for 23 and 24, we have near break-even years. And as you follow that surplus deficit line, that yellow highlighting line across the forecast, you can see once we can no longer rely on that ARPA assistance, we do have that deficit. So this forecast does, I'll talk about income tax, I believe, in my next slide, but it takes into account growth in income tax as well as you can see the growth in expenditures. But long story short, we have this deficit because our growth in expenditures is outpacing what we expect for revenue. So moving on to income tax. I mentioned the 8% increase, over fiscal year '21. So that's what we expect to experience for '22. And then the main reason for that is we saw, it's the impact of wage increases. We see people filing 2 years of income tax currently. They decided to wait, or they couldn't get assistance for all the various programs that's going on. So we are seeing people file for 2 years right now, so that's propping up. And then less people are allocating wages. So that's caused more of an influx of revenue in this particular year. We expect that to back off. I will say one thing for fiscal year '22 is that we do expect to achieve at least 10 million in compliance revenue. So that's been our one-time, button we've gone to help prop up that income tax, go outside those outstanding receivables for the city. Going across the forecast, we expect 4% in fiscal year '23, and then as we've heard from our economic indicators and presentations throughout the winter, we do expect to see this pull back. And with inflation factors, that's why we're backing off that forecast, going to basically this is our 10-year average is 3%. So we thought we'd back off to the 3% average overall, rely on our reserves for now, and see quite where we're heading as far as what kind of recession we would head into. And then as far as the compliance goes, again, that's one-time money, so we expect that to spool off over time. So this just graphically shows our income tax revenue across the general fund. Just overall, it's slow and steady growth. And as far as our areas of concern, we do have a lot of employees still choosing to allocate less than last year, but it's still a factor we're trying to get our arms around. And then, what is going on? We have these geopolitical events, risk of inflation, and supply chain issues that remain a concern. And also being mindful of we can't be reliant on this one-time money of ARPA. We have to use that as a springboard to help us fix the future. So, our fiscal plan summary, as city manager mentioned, we're just shy of $600 million. For our total citywide appropriation. This includes $163 million for specifically the general fund. And again, just some of our other main tenets of what the building blocks are. One thing I haven't mentioned is our capital set aside. It's still at 4.25%. This is consistent with what we budgeted for last year. Our policy level is 5%. So that's one thing to keep in mind as our, asset management is something we're, try to keep up with, make sure we're taking care of our facilities and fleet at the city. So if we're backing down on those dollars, we eventually do want to build back towards the policy level. This is just not the year to do it. And I've already mentioned allocating more money towards contingency, just for the unknown of the coming year. So our policy level is 1.5 billion. We're going to do 2.5. As far as affordability across the city, on our water, sewer, and property tax bills, this is going to work out to approximately $9 more a month per citizen. So. Moving on to our horizon issues. I mentioned expenditures exceeding revenue. That's why we're in a deficit situation, especially in those out years. We're always mindful of keeping track of the state share revenue outlook. They usually do give us an updated forecast in mid-May, so we'll be looking towards that. I don't know if we'll receive it quite before we adopt the budget, but something to keep in mind. And will property taxes continue to be stable? They have been. They are limited by our state statutes, which have left them at. It's a very strong real estate market out there, but they're slow and steady for us. And then being tactical about where we apply that ARPA revenue going forward. We are in union negotiations right now, so we may need to make future adjustments to the budget based on the outcomes of those and Again, making sure we're honoring our OPEB and pension, our, those costs, making sure we're keeping up with our contributions. So as far as the rest of this, we are currently funding some things like our HOT team with one-time money. That's one thing we're going to have to think about for building in long-term should this program prove to be useful for the city. We've had a lot of discussions around cannabis as well as the 201 market redevelopment and the site development out at the Road Commission. And I mentioned that asset management plans remain a concern. We're keeping an eye on fire department, street lighting, facilities management, and traffic safety. Those are areas where we've had to back off some spending just to adjust to what's going on. And again, the Grand River revitalization does take up a large portion of our capital spending right now at $7.14 million across the plan. So now I will turn it over to Ms. Stout.
Thank you. All right. Good morning. So assessing equity in our annual budget began in preparation for our fiscal year 19 by asking each department to use an adapted equity toolkit from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity for one project or initiative in their budget. Approximately 35 submissions we received for the first 2 fiscal years of trying on this toolkit. For FY21, we expanded the process to include proposed budget allocations for those efforts, and we received 100 submissions totaling a little over $14 million. The current fiscal year that we're in expanded to receive over 124 submissions totaling $24 million that directly advance equity in our organization and community. The FY23 draft proposed budget has over $36 million efforts towards equity. This process also includes an analysis and discussion between the city manager department and my office of department workforce diversity data, both currently at the time of the meeting and also trends over time. And then we also strategize opportunities to be more inclusive in our recruitment to help us get closer to demographically representing the diverse community that we serve. Just for shared understanding, equity projects are really those that focus on policy or practice change, establishing data, so that's earlier in the equity spectrum, to establish data to make sure that we have good data, to identify disparities and make real-time decisions to adapt. Address root causes within our control, but also we have a lot of leverage outside, right? So how are these efforts to counter inequitable systems outside of our control? They also tend to include building equity capacity within that department, whether it's training, tools, software, et cetera. And also the intentionality to lead with equity in the beginning, right? So we talk about equity being a part of the DNA, not something you do at the end. And inclusion and focus on those facing the worst of inequities. So when I say equity project, that's what I'm referring to. So this was a theme last year, and it continues to be a really positive theme. Many of the strategies are change in process or protocol that don't necessarily have a budget allocation, but can have a strong impact. Again, if it's in the DNA of what we do, we're going to hopefully see more and more of this actually. Such as, updating the strategic plan to incorporate the welcome plan and strengthen the equity aspects as we continue to grow as an organization. A new trend that I noticed this year with submissions is several strategies as we work in community in new and authentic ways. As we work on partnerships such as, PBGR or Cure Violence, the dollars actually don't come to the city. We're leveraging our influence, but those dollars actually go directly to the community, into organizations to help build their capacity. And I think that's an emerging trend that is positive. I'd also like to, as you hear me say often, racism is deep and pervasive in systems. All systems, such as education, healthcare, banking, or just capitalism in general, and of course, government. So we are still on this journey and working aggressively to move forward. So as always, there is room to improve both the strategies I'm going to share, but also the intentionality to lead with equity among all departments, including the office. I have the absolute honor to lead the Office of Equity and Engagement. So I'm excited to present to you today. So with government excellence, which is on page 31 of the budget letter, there's several here that are listed. Those that I'd like to lift up are the equity analyst position, city manager mentioned. So this is more of a general. We have a river equity analyst that's really focused on the river, but this is a new one that's more broad to help build capacity of departments as they revise or create policy to do it with an equity lens, but to walk alongside those departments, right, is really important. The next one I'd like to highlight are the trainings. All of these trainings are not coming from the Office of Equity Engagement. We're seeing more sector-specific trainings emerging, whether it's building inspections or library services. But the Equity Champions is a great model for those that have had some foundational or intermediate D&I training, to say, how do we take this and apply it to policy and practice, and then have a project within their department to apply that learning. So really excited, and this is for like middle management, because it's also a part of our succession planning. So as we do promotions, we know we're promoting those that have equity experience, not just a heart for it. And then the last three bullets really around undoing some of the harm and trying to make our justice system more just, right, with clean slate and expungement. The next part is on page 32. The first four bullets I'd like to just kind of elevate as far as economic prosperity, because this is really about having people be housed and or being able to stay in their home, which is just critically important, because stable housing is key to economic prosperity. So I just wanted to elevate the efforts and the investments that we're making there as well, among those on the slide. On page 32 and 33 of the budget letter, really excited for this first one. We have an opening in the Office of Equity Engagement that we're retooling to have that person really focus on economic engagement, and I hope to have that posted very soon, and very excited for that one. All of them, but that one I'm really excited about. Of course, participatory budgeting, which we talked about, and the engagement both for local communities of color, but those also that identify and are of immigrant and refugee community is really important. So I'm excited for OPA to have that investment. And then, of course, the digital divide is real, especially in a time where we're still in a pandemic and many things are virtual. So continue to expand broadband internet service is really critical for those in school, work, and just life. Health and environment. I'd like to lift up the water bill and refuge financial assistance. Utility bills across the board, whether they're city or across, continue to rise, but water is so essential to life and health. And so I'm just really excited that we're able to offer these resources to the community, as well as lead service line replacements within the neighborhoods of focus in the 3rd Ward. This is could be a huge cost to homeowners, and I'm very thankful that we have that grant to really invest to take care of that really important cost. Okay, keep going. Mobility, city manager did touch on it. I was going to lift up the Equitable Transportation Pass program. Mobility is important to get to jobs, schools, the parks, right? That wellness that people get from the parks, and just anywhere where they need to go. And so really excited that we're trying to create a multimodal way to get to where we need to get to for our residents. And so, and working in partnership with local organizations to really connect to community to make sure that those passes get in the hands of those that need it. For Safe Community on page 34, I talked about those partnerships with community. I think Cure Violence is a great way, and it's a robust model to stop and prevent violence and getting at some of the core roots. Of course, the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, their origin story, right, is around equity and accountability and trying to make the justice system more just, right? So the entire office. And also, mental health, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic, it's real. And I'm thankful that there's more conversations happening in different communities around mental health, that we're trying to destigmatize it. So having this Network 180 mobile crisis response is critically important so folks can get the service that they need and deserve. And then lastly for this, it's the specific model. So due to economic inequities outside of our control, not everyone can afford to stop work, pay to go to the academy, and then go to that academy. So this model is we actually hire folks that want to be a police officer. We hire them, and while they're on the payroll, we pay for them to go to the academy, and then we continue on with the training. So the model itself is kind of to overturn some of the inequity and barriers that we see. And those cohorts are more diverse than the general department population. Additional highlights, again, no specific budget allocation besides staff time. This is going to be a game changer, embedding equity in professional services for city projects in the RFPs, the contract selection, contract deliverables, et cetera. This is a big game changer for us. Really excited to see Mobile GR's work to review the fees, fines, and related policies and practices, right, that are corrective in nature to assess if there's a disparate impact and make policy change recommendations to eliminate that bias. A $40 ticket to some feels different than it does to others, right? And so how are we adjusting for that? Again, restructuring our RFPs and contracts to be more accessible to small businesses, such as breaking down large bids into smaller contracts, and departments coming together to kind of group work. And so I think that's a great way our departments are collaborating as well. I'd like to lift up today, and more often in the future, the Department of Law under City Attorney, the engagement program, or CEP. One of the examples here is last year, over 1,100 individuals got the option of diversion. That's 1,100 people that do not have additional charge on their record, which is life-changing, right? We know that once you get a record, it's hard to get housing and jobs, and there's just this avalanche of difficulties. So that's just one of the data points, and so really a great program, and so thank you. And of course, the welcome plan that we're working on and the Equity Champions projects, whether it's a more intentional recruitment for the fire department, sending a list of all the financial assistance that we offer in the summer bills, the tax bills, to let everyone know at a glance, like this is what you need, right? These are different opportunities. And having our dashboards get more deeper into data so we can make data-informed decisions, among many. Again, these are just highlights. Next. And so to go deeper into one example is our micro-local business enterprise policy revision. Since the adoption of the strategic plan, we have had over 200% growth in MLBs registered and getting certified with the city. That is wonderful. That is exactly, yes, it's a huge increase. So we are amending administrative policy to adapt for this success, to do an annual review. So we review the businesses and kind of go through their documents and that sort of thing. We're going to switch it to a 3-year cycle because reviewing every year for a business is actually quite burdensome for that business because these are smaller in nature. And then it's also more realistic because as the number of MLBEs increased, our staff is not. So just to be really open, it's more realistic for all. Additional strategies, we've really been focusing on registration. We also want to add a heavy focus on utilization. It's great to have them in our system, but let's use them, right? Let's utilize that. So we're going to focus on that. Supporting the selection of the new ERP system to really capture that data as vendors that are registered and be able to report out. The current system is very difficult. Embed equity in professional services that we talked about. We talked about contracts. And then Mr. A.J. Hills and Payday Cottle from my office working with other departments such as comptroller and purchasing to do these trainings with colleagues and boards and commissions on how do you find these diverse and smaller businesses and use them. And then of course the work C.R. Atkins and others with the Grand River equity efforts to make sure that there's equity in that project in the river and along the banks. So these are just some of the highlights, and I would like to thank my colleagues who all submitted this and the back and forth. It's a great opportunity and very honored to get to know them in this way.
Okay, Mayor, we'll pause for questions. I do want to just highlight that last future policy change was a result of an internal audit that we responded to that really highlighted some of the systematic things that were well intended at the time but not practical in helping us continue to expand equity among small business owners.
All right. Thank you, City Manager. Thank you, Ms. Stout and Ms. Claren. So first off, thank you for this really thorough presentation that highlights all of the work being done throughout the entire organization. I think it captures a lot of the priorities that we around this table have talked about, not just this past year, but for the past several years. So I really appreciate that. I'll start with just a concrete question, and then I'll turn to my colleagues to see if they have questions or comments. Going back to revenue sharing, I know that there was an increase last year at the state. There's also a proposed increase for this year. I know it hasn't been passed yet in the state budget, but can we get a sense of kind of the history of revenue sharing and where we are projecting it to be, even if it's, so I saw a little bit in one of the slides, but I didn't see a year over year, where we used to be a decade ago, where we are today, and where we think those numbers will be in the next 3 years. And I don't know, in the chart, is that part of other revenues?
It is part of other revenues. It's
Not broken out
It's
anymore?
not broken out. I know in the past we have included a graph to show where we
Yeah.
were over time. I think at mid-year I might have used the graph to show, I believe in 2020, 21, they were, or I'm trying to think, we had a dip. The state sometimes goes to that bucket to,
Yeah.
pay for other things. It's like, what about us? But they did backfill it, I believe, in 21 with CARES dollars. So that's why we saw that uptick in other revenues. Some of that was attributed to the what they backfilled with CARES dollars, and we received more than what we expected.
Right.
So I can provide, though, the current forecast we're working off of as follow-up.
Usually I'm used to those three graphs, income tax, property tax, and revenue sharing, which
We
obviously.
can get that for you, Mayor.
Yeah, we
Sure.
know make up the vast majority of the general fund, so thanks. I just think it's good for us to have a good sense of those three different buckets and where
Absolutely.
they've been and where we hope that they go or project they go.
Yep.
Thank you for that. All right, Commissioners, I'll open it up for questions or comments before we move to the next section. Commissioner?
Good morning, everybody. Wake up. I just have a couple questions. On slide 33, I didn't quite understand the front-loading piece for Vital Streets in 2022. I remember us doing this at the onset of Vital Streets before the revenue was generated, but I'm not sure in the middle of Vital Streets why we would have the need to do that.
I wasn't sure if you were going to give me a list.
I could. You know me, that's true.
You're switching things up on me.
I am.
As far as Vital Streets goes, we, just because of the projects that had to come and play leading up to that big bullet bond payment, I believe the former CFO's was chasing a yield. So that's why the debt was structured that way. So long story short, basically there wasn't enough reserve held in the fund where we had to go ahead and just access this revenue, kind of give the Vital Streets program a loan in order to make that bond payment. So it was yeah, we just didn't have enough of the.
So it finally caught up
Reserve
with
there.
us essentially.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Then the other question is on the slide 44. This is the surplus and deficit. And just kind of looking at the forecast for 2025 and beyond, well, even 2024. I'm assuming this doesn't take into account annually what we would put in surplus then. Am I reading the highlighted line correctly?
Annually, the surplus deficit is simply what is going to be contributed to the fund balance of the general fund. It doesn't have anything to do with like the budget stabilization fund, if that's what
Okay.
you're getting at.
Yeah.
So one thing I will note that it didn't mention is we cannot contribute to the budget stabilization fund until we're able to achieve operating revenues that exceed operating expenditures. So because we're being propped up right now by grant revenue, we're not able to make that contribution. So we'll see how this picture changes, and I'll definitely let you know, because obviously we like having that rainy day fund and we want to get back to policy level, but right now, yeah, we're propped up by that ARPA revenue, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Commissioner, if I could add.
Please.
So as I look at the 5x5, in the structural deficit, if we fix fiscal year '25, it will address '26 and '27. So we really have about $11 million gap to close if the revenue assumptions are in line with the conservative projections. As CFO mentioned, 8% this year, 3% in out years. If we don't outperform those assumptions and we hold expenditures where projected, we'll have to close that. I feel pretty confident. You all have seen over the past three budgets, we've closed $30 million deficits, $20 million deficits. I feel pretty confident that that will be not an insurmountable change to address if need be.
At that time, okay, thank you. And then slide 57, under the broadband internet services, I know last week at the State of the County, they were mentioning prioritizing broadband as well. So I'm just curious to know what conversations are we having with the county to, for me, it just seems easy, right? Like I'm thinking I call Xfinity and I get broadband and I'm done. And it just seems like this conversation has been, 2.5, 3 years in the making, and it doesn't feel as though enough broadband progress has been made, with the exception of the broadband, networks that we had in the parks, the neighborhood parks. So I thought that was a really good plan. So I'm just curious to know, 100,000 doesn't seem like a lot. I don't even know why we would even need to contribute to it financially if the county is prioritizing this. And how do we put some light under whoever's role it is to make sure that this is done sooner than later?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we are going to discuss this at a later budget presentation. What that 100,000 is right now is our current plan to roll out broadband specifically in the parks. So that money is going to be housed in the Parks and Rec Department or managed by them. So, but we can get you more information as far as there has been some coordination with the county. So that's one thing that's been tricky with the ARPA revenue. Everyone's received an allocation, so they're always calling up each other like, what are you doing? So we'll compensate over here, those kind of things.
But if I remember right, sorry, City Manager, if I remember correctly, the county helped initially with some of the equipment for the hotspots in the public spaces.
Okay.
They did that countywide, but then they said if you want to continue the service, it would ultimately be the individual communities.
So they did, did ended up using about 57,000 from the county's CARES allocation specifically to kickstart that parks rollout.
Yeah.
So now that they have more money and fewer people to divvy it out to, perhaps they can fully fund it and fund it broadly enough that it'll make the impact that we're all saying we know is needed.
Yeah, that'd be great. City Manager, did you have follow-up? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that we will follow up with County Administrator Vandenberg about the implementation plan and have Mr. Matthews give the update when we do the section on governmental excellence.
Thank you. Great, thanks. Did you have any more?
All set, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to come over here to Commissioner Jones, and then I'll come over here to Commissioner Isasi. Try to make sure I turn to both sides of the dais. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to city staff thus far for the presentations on this morning. Curious about, first and foremost, slide 54. Ms. Stout, you mentioned the under equity projects addressing root cause within our control. I would love to hear more about that. I tend to believe that we are probably best, or if the goal is to bring about real change, it is to further address root cause. And just if you can give me some example of ways in which we are looking to address it, and I'd like to perhaps see if in the future we can address it in an even greater degree. So just wondering.
Commissioner Jones, I feel like you and I could talk all day. The root cause, I think we know, right? Racism, right? It's the root cause. And so within our power of control, we're over today, the budget. We are also over as we think about policy. And I think city managers' investment for more engagement is going to help us have a broader perspective on what equity means in real life every day in the neighborhoods. As we look at this policy, how is it going to have direct impact? Right, like direct, not trickle down or in 10 years. How is it going to have immediate impact, long-term impact, working with communities? So I think our within our control is who we co-create with is within our control. How we invest, how we show up in community. I think the equity champions. That was part of the analysis, right? And so they think they're going to do one project, and then they start going through the layers. They're like, oh, it's expansive, right? So how are we going to work on this piece, knowing that we'll do this next piece next time? So I think the Equity Champions is a good model, and that's all the departments have an opportunity to be involved with that. And I think also change making, movement making, right? So it's more awareness, it's more eyes open to it. Everyone's lived reality is different, right? I think about race every day as a brown woman raising brown children. So that's my lens. Every day I think about it, right? On and off the clock. So I think that's just a few high-level examples. It's the approach to the work, but we are over policy, we are over budgets, we are over, where we recruit from. We're over a lot of things, and so we do have a lot of power. And so I don't want to minimize that. And we're within systems, right? We're local government, within county government, within state government, national government. And so we're also within systems. So we need to identify where's our power, leverage it, and then where do we have influence? And like you were saying, Commissioner Lanier earlier, leverage it.
Another question is regarding the equity analyst position. Just in general, are we reviewing all of our policies in each department? Is that part of our work? Is that part of the future plan?
Yes, with more capacity. So I like to count how many policies we have to go through. I almost don't want to count, actually. It's several hundred. So I think the plan right now is that she's still onboarding. So she's onboarding. The plan, she's going to be over the equity champions, because what that does is it helps departments be able to review their own policies through a lens and create tools. So when we come to present to you, you know how you used to do A3s? It would be like an equity analyst. So it's not always the Office of Equity Engagement. If the Office of Equity Engagement is the only office that does equity work, we failed, right? It's all of our work. So, but to get to your point, the long-term vision, yes, we want every policy reviewed. I think we're going to start with prioritizing those with the most impact.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Great question. Commissioner Isasi, and then Commissioner O'Connor, did you have okay. So Commissioner Isasi, then O'Connor.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to add my thanks to everyone, all the work that's gone into this, and kind of that reflection mark, City Manager, of these budgets over the course of years that have not been sort of normal. And so I appreciate all of you saying what was considered normal. We don't want that to be our future normal. Ms. Stout, you talked about policies and the reflection that these are things that we have created, and not all of us necessarily in these same places, but what's in our circle of influence, our circle of concern, and our circle of control. So thank you for saying that. I did want to pick up where Commissioner Lanier left off on the broadband perspective, because I think this is where, when I think about community engagement and the education to residents appreciate the little dollar infographics, Ms. Claren, about where are their dollars going? So we can talk about what are investments that we made, because I remember in the broadband pieces, we selected specific parks and we try to make it geographically based upon the city and where was that impact. But then to your point, Commissioner Lanier, what are we contributing? What is the county contributing? What are residents contributing to both our city and also to the county? And I'd like to make sure that we understand that in the best way. So I just wanted to affirm that, Commissioner Lanier. I'm going to hold all the ones for policing until the next section, right? Okay, just wanted a point of order on that. On the language access piece, I appreciate this. I think, I can't remember what meeting it was, but I know maybe it was in the mid-year review, asking Mr. Matthews about what does that utilization look like? Because I think it's not only that we offer it, how is it being utilized? And recognizing not only the language perspective, but the nuances of how our meetings are held. Honestly, I think until Commissioner Lanier helped me back when you were elected, many things are confusing about the order and the process and pieces. Even sometimes we ask ourselves, is it table, is postpone? So looking at language is utilization, access, utilization, and then how do we take in the information, I think would be important to that. So that would be something I'd be looking for, but I'm certainly supportive of that. On the DASH operations piece, City Manager, will we discuss that more fully? You had mentioned a third, were you at a 1/3 utilization? Okay, so I'll hold that question. And then I think my last question is, I have two more questions. So the next one is around, obviously embedding equity and we're seeing that this is a long process to get to the equitable results we want to have. So Ms. Stout, you talked about year over year and where we're at and what city staff are working on. I also am wondering how does that correspond to, we talked about other funds that we leverage. Certainly some organizations are coming, like they maybe have been created or co-created due to an equity consideration, but those that might not have been, how do we make sure that they're also living out those values of equity? If we're leveraging dollars with them, or if they're receiving dollars to support something from the city. So I'd like to understand that, because I think if we're going to do it internally, we should also be asking those partners what their plans are and how they intend to make best use of those dollars. So I'm thinking of things, in our economic development department, other funds that we've leveraged, like through congressional dollars, and just making sure that if we're going to say this, that still is a reflection of our work. And then my last question, and then I have one statement, is on the Black Business Expo African American Task Force. Just wondering how that connects to some of the other RFPs that we reviewed in the mid-year regarding the revolving loan fund and the RFP from economic development. Through day job, I think what I've been able to find is at least one of the corridor improvement authorities, they were thinking about their facade improvement programs, and people want to access it, but they're unable to leverage that money out of their own pocket initially. And so then they don't use it. And then it's Southtown is the one that we've been talking to. And so we have this program, but we're not able to utilize the dollars. So how do we bring in some of those other entities that are in our sort of bubble of economic development, because we have the funds there, but we can't always leverage them in the right way. So I want to make sure that those pieces are connected. And I think that is some of what we were looking to do, again, in my day job of how do we either create loans that are zero interest, so then people can utilize that. It's guaranteed money. We know it's coming in, and get those facade dollars out the door. And then I just want to affirm all the work with the MLBE items that you talked about. So you talked about not only increasing it, but utilization. So again, I think going deeper into what is that equity journey. I also would say, city manager, I support us looking at all of our economic development investments that we have, which this is a new program. So to look at the investments that have been made, I know this has been a short journey, but we also have other investments that are in our city that I think we need to continue to evaluate and make sure that we're living up to the reasons that we supported it. So the types of jobs, the amount of dollars that are being spent for wages. So I would just support that generally too. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll turn to Ms. Stout and then a city manager.
Well,
Did you want to start?
I was just
Go
going to
ahead.
say, perhaps on the ones that relate to economic prosperity, I see the staff taking note, and we'll make sure we address those on the 10th.
Okay.
Specifically.
Okay.
Now, if there's other things related to equity that you wanted to address now, but all the other questions around business development, we'll make sure we include that on the 10th.
Great.
So I did get the list, so thank you. So most of those were going to, but I can speak to the language services. So this current fiscal year, we have a draft policy, and then we did a pilot to see how it would work. And we had I almost don't want to list them, but like 311, the planning department, mobile GR, my office, and one other one, sorry, I'm forgetting. So they did a pilot to say, okay, if this policy was real now, what would that look like? And so one example is planning. I mean, they've dozens and dozens of documents they've been translating, just all their applications and their forms and making it not just in Spanish, but readable. Because sometimes things in English, it's like, English is my first language, and I don't even know what some documents say, right? And so that's just one example of how we're testing the rollout, but it does cost financial resources. So to start mid-year, when they already had their set budget, we're starting in the new fiscal year to have that administrative policy go through. And then, of course, training, because it's a new way to be, right? And we got to practice that muscle, and having information really available. Anything from, at the service windows to have many languages, and they can point to their language and everyone knows how to call the language line, right? Or the Hispanic Center, which is one of our providers. So there's going to be a lot of education and training around the rollout. And we'll continue to iterate and adapt just like we do this process.
Thanks, Ms. Dowd. And I'll just add, I know many of us have been a part of community conversations over the last couple weeks, especially with our immigrant and refugee communities, and translation services has been a key issue that many people have talked to us about. So I think it's incumbent on us to do what we can here within the city, but then also to encourage and work with our partners at the county and the state level, especially our Secretary of State. One, to bring those concerns to her attention, but then to also to make sure that they have interpretation services in multiple languages to help people at every level of government. So we have that on our list of items to follow up with, both at the county level and the state level. So just know that that's on our, I think many of us have a long to-do list based on some of the conversations we're recently having, but that one is definitely on mine. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. And now I'll turn it to Commissioner O'Connor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for this information thus far. Look forward to continuing the dialogue around this. Just a couple quick kind of high-level top questions for me are, as it relates to the, our savings, which again, I always appreciate the conservative nature of our fiscal department in ensuring we have adequate money set aside for uncertainties, which obviously we're living through currently. But just given the high, we have a policy goal of 25% fund balance when we're going to sit at around 34% based on this budget, which is laudable and great. But then, to hear you say 4.25 annual income tax capital set aside, and then to say we don't have any money to fund that is, it's yes and no. It's about how we prioritize, correct? And if fund balance are general fund dollars that are set aside and are flexible, and we have a policy to have a certain percentage set aside of income tax. I do the math on that. That tells me that 3/4 points is about $800,000. Not really that big of a deal in a $56 million surplus fund balance. And then the same, I think, goes for the budget stabilization fund, which again was something, the mayor and her colleagues set up during the last financial crisis to ensure that we can weather uncertainty. We're only projecting a point down on that. To me, that's about $1.6 million. So, all in, we're a little over, $2 million, whatever that ends up being, $2.4 million out of a $56 million surplus. We can still have a 31% general fund savings and fully fund the other things to our policy levels. So to me, that just seems like, again, it's all the same money. It's all available for us to use. But if we have a policy and we have the ability to meet the policy and to know that it restricts those funds so that they can't be spent in a manner that's not consistent with what our policy says. I just feel like we should do that if we can,
Sure.
Knowing that there's still a surplus in excess of our typical 25% policy that gives us flexibility with flexible dollars, but ensures that the things that we said we're going to commit to the taxpayers we do.
So we do have a plan to scale back into that. That's across the 5-year. I'm trying to remember how quickly we get to the 5%. I believe it's by year 4 of the 5-year plan. So we did decide to start shifting back that way. We did not want to present a budget that shows a deficit for fiscal year 23, but recognizing that we are allocating ARPA in there, that's helping us achieve a surplus. So we didn't change that allocation for this fiscal year. As far as those asset classes that are behind, I think preliminarily we were thinking about using those revenue recovery dollars to help fund any asset classes that are lacking. We've done that with mobile GR, but we'll be looking at street lighting and probably traffic safety in the coming year. So I'd expect to see budget amendments related to those if we do have pressing projects. So.
My follow-up question.
Sure.
My other follow-up question just relates to the out-year projections for income tax growth. Understanding, again, we're in an inflationary environment, which is causing, everything to rise. And yet I assume that, wages are somewhat keyed to, rising levels of inflation on cost of goods. So to say that we have a 4.3% increase when we know that inflation is, currently exceeding that, seems like we're not being honest about what we think real wages are going to grow in the next, at least 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. So I just, again, not that necessarily impacts. I know that that's it's a conservative accounting move on our part, but
right.
it still feels like, we like to make decisions based on this 5-year out curve, but if we're not making decisions based on a real 5-year out curve and we're being overly conservative on that, then it seems like we then predict, that we're going to run a deficit in 5 years when we're not really going to run a deficit in 5 years because Ms.
Sure.
Claren wouldn't let me run a deficit in 5 years if she has anything.
If I had a crystal ball, we put together this forecast based on the best information we had at the time. So that's why I qualify when I explain the forecast is we do have these reserves, so we can choose to be conservative and see what happens. So that's why we shaped our forecast as we did with the ARPA dollars, helping to fill in the gaps. And we're not overcorrecting, we're not oversteering the ship right now, making huge corrections, staff layoffs or, service reductions or anything like that, because we know we have time. And working with, Mr. Matthews, who heads up the innovation department, we're going to look at ways to just be more efficient as a city as well, still work on achieving cost savings and hopefully correct for that in the future, but we know we have time. So yeah, you could argue my estimates are conservative, but I also know we are a dynamic organization where we do move around and change our allocations. Since I've been CFO, I think I've been talking to you guys about almost quarterly of, okay, here's where we're at now, because we do have a uncertain, it's been a rocky path. This is my, I believe, third budget with, and they've all been during, city manager was talking, they've all been crazy. I'm like, yeah, they have been. I feel like I've been here 15 years. So we're still figuring it out, but yeah.
Mayor, if I could.
Go ahead, City Manager.
So to go back to the first point on the policy, because I've heard this from other commissioners, with our surplus funding in reserves, if there's a desire to put more in the budget stabilization, $1 million, $2 million, we can do that. What I think it will show is a wider deficit. That couple of $1 million will be reflected in the forecast years on 25, 26, apart from adjusting the revenue projections. So I'm comfortable either way, the money's going to be there. And if it makes this body feel like we would be more disciplined in future years to pull from the stabilization fund and versus having a discretionary annual budget, that's fine. $11 million, $13 million gap to close is essentially the same for me.
All right, thanks, City Manager. And Commissioner O'Connor, I hear what you're saying, and I feel like we do have this conversation every year that every budget year. And I think you make a good point. I think the other thing I think about is when we look at our revenue streams, income tax tends to be the most volatile, and we know that. And we've seen pretty significant highs and lows and fluctuations. And so it's, in my opinion, out of property tax and revenue sharing and income tax, it's the most challenging, I would say, to predict accurately. Hopefully, these are conservative numbers and they come in higher. And as we look at the out years, those numbers, the deficit is much smaller. But it's a hard issue.
Yeah, I will just add, me and my deputy did go back to see, okay, what have our predecessors have, estimated, and during that 11-year, period of economic expansion and stuff, they never estimated the out years above 2.5%, and we're like, oh, are we being too aggressive? So it is a,
I remember this conversation with Scott Buerer and with Jeff and now with you. So it's a long-standing conversation that we've had.
Oh, sure.
And we have to take into consideration we've done more compliance work, and that's one-time dollars as well. So it is, I understand the difficulty.
Yeah.
Commissioner, and then I'll go over here to Commissioner.
Yeah, one other question, just to follow up on the OPEB funding as well. I mean, again, work that was done 15 years ago during the last economic downturn to set us on a course for not having this unfunded liability someday. And, the trend lines continue to get closer and closer. When do you anticipate getting to 100% based on the current trend? And then does that what is the out year financial impact of that, knowing that we're not going to have as much liability we're responsible for on a year-to-year basis? And how does that impact, those out years? Because I feel like it's going to fall somewhere in your 5x5.
Sure. And I don't want to misspeak, so I can follow up with GRS, get the forecast. I know they talked to us briefly about that last summer, but I can follow up with you on that. I do know that when we did in the city's history, when we did get to a state of being more than 100% funded, we chose not to, as the body chose not to do a contribution into the fund because it's good, it's earning interest, it's able to support itself. So that's a discussion we would have at that point if we do want to forego doing a, ongoing, not put so much, keep building on that if it's already 100% funded. So it could potentially provide relief though to the rest of the city.
Yeah.
Well, again, I don't think I'm advocating either way on that.
Yeah.
Whether we should stop making a payment. I just wonder when the lines cross.
Yeah.
Anticipated for the lines to cross, and then is there a policy decision that we have to make in terms of do we continue? Like I know on the pension side, a policy was changed a decade ago to ensure that we can't not keep making a pension payment, but I don't know how that I don't know what the OPEB policy is on.
Yeah, and definitely I can follow up with more information if we've ever put through a policy of what we decide to do when. I know the city in the past, as far as financially, likes to have the flexibility to change course if they need to, but
We
yeah.
are they.
Yeah.
We are they, Molly.
Huh?
We are they.
oh, we were yeah. I know. I'm sorry. I'm talking in the third person.
So let me just say, Mayor, what we can, as she said, get the projections on the annual required contributions to see if there is, at the current rate, when will we meet our 100% of our annual requirement? But just to be clear, we have a well-funded plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
comparatively to other cities, that's true. I actually would like to see the trend line for both the OPEB as well as the general pension fund.
Sure.
Obviously, we made changes to those funds with the intent of having more long-term sustainability. So it'd be nice to know when those trend lines when we get to 100% funded, and then how much that frees up in our general fund.
Sure.
So, okay, thanks. Commissioner Repart?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Ms. Stout. I have just one comment, and John took two of my questions, and then I have one other one. But I think that for me, when I think about how do we move faster than incremental change for systemic change, we have a shining example here in what we've done with our equity investments. And so I want to make a strong thank you to the city manager for running with that, to Stacy Stout for doing that capacity building department to department, because that's how we move faster than incremental change. That's how we build synergy. That's how we build intersectionality. And I still think that, Ms. Sutter had a lot of bullets under health and environment, and I think that we can take that same model and leverage it for our climate goals and our sustainability goals. And the same is true for public safety. I mean, the mobile GR department stepped up. I think that if we want to eliminate and alleviate some pressure on our department, mobile GRs raised their hand and said, we'll take parking tickets. We're going to put more lights in our parking garages. Planning department's got the SEPTED program. And so I think that there's a couple of other opportunities to implement that same system to increase our speed of change from incremental to something beyond that. So that's a huge win. There's 100 things to celebrate in there, and I can't name them all, but I wrote them all down. John's was quicker on the math with me around, I was going to ask the question around what would it take to meet our goals and check in about our liability. The question I have is remaining is around the ARPA fundings that's remaining. I want to just make sure I get that chart right. As I see it, after we approve this budget, we'll still have about 30 million in hand. Is that correct, City Manager? 20 that is unallocated, 4 for the courts, and 6 as a contingency. Is that? I just want to make sure that I'm getting that right.
That's projected for the next couple of years.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great.
Thank you. All right, Commissioners, I think I'm going to close this section, and we're going to move now to public safety. And so again, thank you both for all of your work. and for the presentation. Very helpful. And I'll turn it to our city manager to tee up the conversation around public safety.
Okay, I'm going to ask all the public safety departments to come to the front. They're all doing the Canfield stroll. As we come. Commissioners, do we need a break? I see some attorney, you want to take a 5
Okay, why don't we
minute-
take a 2-minute, while you all are getting set up, why don't we take a 2-minute restroom break
All right.
and coffee break? So 2 minutes, right back in there.
I know, I'm just saying.
That will give them more time.
All right. Wasn't Commissioner Moody just here? Where'd he go? All right. I'm gonna bring us back together because I know some of us have hard stops at noon today, so we'll go ahead and get started. We have Chief Winstrom, the first time we're seeing him in a uniform, so congratulations to you and DC Rogers and Mr. Brandon Davis. So we'll move forward, starting with the city manager to open up this section of our presentation today, and then turn it over.
Thank you, Mayor. And unlike the other sections where we'll follow up, we'll do this with public safety, but we want to answer as many of your questions today that you have, and then if there's additional questions, we certainly will follow up at the end of future work sessions. So with that, we'll start with the police department, then continue with the oversight office, and then we'll pause for what questions you have.
Okay, great. All right. Good morning, Chief.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. The recent officer-involved shootings put a spotlight on policing, specifically issues surrounding transparency, accountability, use of force, policy, and training and community engagement. The investigation of this tragic event will likely inform decisions moving forward, and topics such as ensuring the sanctity of life is a top priority of Grand Rapids police officers, ensuring only the minimum force necessary is used for law enforcement purposes, and that traffic enforcement is public safety focus are early issues I will focus on. Ensuring officers in the Grand Rapids Police Department are receiving the best training on use of force, de-escalation, crisis intervention, and cultural competency are a priority. I recognize the gravity of this time for policing in Grand Rapids. I'm confident in our ability to move forward in the right direction as an organization. I've been here just 54 days and I'm still very much learning, but I fully support the budget where you'll see resources allocated to do the job to the best benefit of the community, working with the community. As I continue to evaluate the department and make improvements, I look forward to returning to this body to update you in the coming months. The police department has 305 sworn and 121 non-sworn positions to serve our city of over 200,000. By September, we expect to reduce our sworn vacancies to 15. Each year, the department responds to approximately 76,000 calls for service. We maintain accreditation with the Commission for Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies for both the Police Department and Dispatch Center, and our latent print unit is accredited by the American Association for Laboratory Accreditation. As you can see here, an overview of our budget shows a majority of the general fund, 83%, is personnel costs. Shown here is a breakdown of personnel costs, indicating 56% of costs are attributed to full-time employees and 21% for retirement fund contributions. This is a breakdown by units within the police department. As you can see, the patrol unit takes the largest share at 51%, followed by the detective unit, which accounts for 13%. Shown here, the total percent of the general fund has decreased significantly since fiscal year 2021, a total of 4.44% decrease. I'm now going to briefly turn the presentation over to Deputy Chief Rogers to discuss personnel, staffing, partnerships, and training.
Thank you. We have shown this graph in previous presentations and wanted to circle back with our projected and actual numbers regarding staffing. We projected to have 303 sworn officers at GRPD in May of 2022. However, due to low numbers of applicants and eligible hires, we are currently only at 289. And this includes our 10 recruits that had just started the police academy yesterday. We are now projecting to be at our allocated 305 sworn staff in late spring of 2023. Regarding neighborhood-based policing, we are anticipating all the 33 beats to be covered in the late spring of 2023 based on staffing and recruiting. The homeless outreach team, the mobile crisis intervention team, and housing code enforcement are all co-response teams with civilian partners, all of which align with the department's strategic plan and looking at alternative ways to respond to calls for service and solving community issues. Police department training. Almost all the trainings at GRPD are scenario-based and involve decision-making and de-escalation. Moving forward, Chief Winstrom will be conducting a review of all the in-house trainings and collaborate with Office of OPA and adding additional community-based training. In late 2021, GRPD rolled out a data-informed community engagement program, which we call DICE. This program aligns with the strategic plan and engaging a collaborative problem-solving initiative with our community and maximizes the use of data to provide timely and accurate intelligence. We'll continue the implementation of this initiative in all areas of the city. This just shows some of the key performance indicators, which we often look at regarding crime in our community, which is aggravated assault and homicides. As we see, aggravated assaults continued to rise in 2021. However, homicides did decrease. And as you show in the graph, we present things based on incident numbers. So we added an additional marking on there to show actually the number of victims. Community engagement units have been able to be, of course, we've been able to re-engage since the shutdown of many events due to COVID in 2020, and I already covered the percentage of beats within the city. This is just the key performance indicators for dispatch. They reached their targeted goal in 2021, answering 95.06% of 911 calls within 5 seconds and answered over 99.57% of the 911 calls within 40 seconds. For accomplishments and current initiatives, just to highlight some with the Drive for Success partnership, of course with the Boys and Girls Club, 22 students have participated to remove cost barriers, to provide professional driver education and improve safety skills. Our guys did partner with the Office of OPA to include Know Your Rights campaign into this program. This program is still growing with additional businesses contacting us and willing to participate, again, moving it forward. 45 crisis intervention officer, so far 45 officers are trained in crisis intervention, which is a 40-hour school. Addition, we provide smaller sections of this training, but we're continued and devoted to doing 2 full of the 40-hour trainings a year. Clergy on patrol. Faith-based leaders, of course, are partnering with our officers to build bridges. Our CLEAR program, recidivism rates drop an average of 28 to 15% for people who attend at least 4 meetings with our officers in that program. And we continue to collaborate with GRCC, GVSU, and again, recruiting, focus on diversity, removing barriers where possible. We did just recently purchase the ESOF background software, which will hopefully streamline the background process and allow even applicants to apply via their mobile device rather than needing a computer. We're continuing to moving forward to sponsor the 2 academies, hopefully, that we were able to this year, plan travels to neighborhood states, military bases, and historically Black colleges and universities, and outreach with diversity, inclusion, multicultural organizations at in-state colleges.
Information received from the community is very important to us, and we look to embrace and enhance community input by expanding the Police Chief's Advisory Team to include new members representing emerging populations, continue our conversations with groups such as the ACLU, Link Up, NAACP, Urban League, neighborhood groups, and others, continue our listening sessions with faith-based organizations, partner with OPA to receive community input on department training, as well as look into and act upon information received from community surveys. Establish a 60-day action plan, which includes a complete review of department and policies and procedures, a review of all non-state mandated training, a review of police equipment, including body-worn camera system that we utilize, deployment strategies for sworn officers, establishing a team to work on the continuation of the strategic plan, and evaluating and updating the civilian chief of staff job description and responsibilities moving forward. That concludes our presentation.
Mayor, we'll hear from the Oversight Office, but just to clarify, Chief, that's in the next 60 days, not on your 60th day of employment. Next 60 days.
That is correct. I have 6 days.
Okay, good morning.
I'll be providing the update regarding the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. This first slide talks about an overview. So OPA serves as that independent city department that works to increase transparency and accountability throughout the city. Our primary work involves receiving and assisting community members with navigating internal processes. OPA also works with our Cure Violence program. This budget reflects $1,713,034 of investment in OPA. It's important to note that that's increased from the $404,781 in fiscal year 22. And that also gives us, and there's also an anticipated ability to leverage an additional $850,000 toward the work of OPA. That's an anticipated budget of $2,563,000, which is a 537% increase. This is a good budget for OPA. OPA has recently been awarded a grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in the amount of $250,000 per year for 3 years to increase staffing capacity. We're also a finalist for a Harvard Bloomberg Fellow, which will also assist with increasing OPA's capacity. This next slide really shows the overview of our budget. If you start with fiscal year 21 and look to where we find it today, the changes in this budget include the addition of an administrative aid position, $75,000 toward Cure Violence, $150,000 staff contract position for community engagement, $100,000 focused on training that's done in partnership with community, and we'll talk about that more on the future staff, and then an $850,000 move of the body camera contract to OPA. This next slide breaks down our personnel. So if you look at the first fiscal year when OPA became in office, there was one staff person, me, and over time we've continued to add to the office. So if you look during fiscal year 22, there were 2 FTEs in our budget, and we also have had great collaboration from the Human Resources Department that has been loaning us a staff person throughout the last fiscal year. So with that combined with our temporary staff, it brought us to 4 in this current fiscal year. But looking ahead to fiscal year 2023, there is the 3 people that will be in our budget. That includes that aid position we just spoke about. HR is going to continue to allow us to borrow that staff person for continued continuity of operations through the end of December. We also have 2 contract positions, and then the grant-funded positions, 2 that have already been awarded through the Kellogg Foundation, and then another that's anticipated through the Harvard Bloomberg. So that will bring our staffing totals to 8, and if we include that temporary HR position that'll bring us to 9. So if we look at our strategic plan, you may recall that OPA operates from the acronym CARE, which is Change, Accountability, Restorative Justice, Empowerment, and Engagement. When we talk about change, we're talking about the fact that OPA helps to improve public safety policies and operations through innovation and collaboration. So some of the spaces where we've been collaborating on is with the fire department on their recruiting methods. I'm very proud of the work that Kevin Curio-Vasquez has been doing. In fact, he mapped out a project as part of his master's program in this area. So we're excited about that work. We've also been working to review our arbitration process and improving diversity in recruitment and retention of all public safety staff, specifically in relation to automatic disqualifiers of candidates. Under accountability, OPA helps to improve individual, supervisory, and organizational accountability for public safety activities through civilian oversight of all public safety operations. This really is the space where we talk about case evaluation, monitoring, and investigating. Throughout the last fiscal year, OPA reviewed all 20 complaint disposition reports that were provided to us. We created a framework for reimagining the Civilian Appeal Board, and we look forward to implementing that. We also finalized a review process for the OPA policy. We're excited about what will come from that with the partnership with Chief Wistrom and the police department. We finalized our case management system for incoming complaints. The city manager also released an administrative order which helped OPA to begin to have access to police records. And Chief Winstrom also invited OPA immediately into the process of overseeing and monitoring the officer-involved shooting here in Grand Rapids. And again, I'm thrilled to have a commitment from Chief Winstrom to work with OPA to improve the sharing of information and ability to perform oversight of GRPD. And I do want to add there that just the very nature, the feeling of the relationship has changed drastically. I wouldn't say this if it weren't true. Chief Winstrom has already shown a real commitment to this work, and I believe we will go very far with it. On this next slide, you see restorative justice. And when we look at restorative justice, that means that OPA will help reduce barriers to trust that have been created by systemic inequities in the criminal justice system or that cause disparate outcomes. A shining example of that is the Clean Slate GR Expungement Fair that we hosted just over a month ago. During that time, 500 community members were served to determine their expungement eligibility and receive the necessary documents to move forward. Out of those individuals, 297 were able to file and submit their expungement applications. We're very excited and grateful for the many community partners who stepped up to help us to complete this. This was a great day for Grand Rapids, and we don't have a lot of time, but I'll share that I sat down with someone who was literally in tears as we had a conversation, and they said that they felt like their life changed at that moment, and that's the work that we're doing. On this next slide, we see empowerment and engagement. OPA helps to enhance communication and education with the public regarding public safety matters. That includes our Know Your Rights program, as well as our Let's Talk About It program, and the work we do with planning and participating in town halls and community meetings. That includes attending protests and listening to the issues that are raised by community to inform policy considerations and recommendations. An example of that is the work that we did with our surveillance policy. That was in response to information that we heard from community and partners who stepped up to come to the table, and we worked together to get that done. Additionally, there have been strategic conversations with community leaders regarding public safety matters in the recent weeks. That's include lots of conversations with members of our African immigrant and refugee community, and we'll talk about that more on future slides. These next slides talk about our work with Cure Violence here in Grand Rapids. We're excited about what's being done here. We have recently secured $600,000 from the federal government in earmarks, along with the $300,000 from Spectrum Healthcare that we also received, which is now at the $200,000 mark. So that gets us to $800,000 in outside funding that we have currently for Cure Violence. When we formally launched Cure Violence in partnership with the Urban League, we now see that there's been 328 interactions with key individuals involved in violent acts and 447 with non-key individuals, which are individuals who are not involved or inciting the violence but live in the target area and are impacted by that. One of the most important things, or one of the greatest things that Cure Violence has been able to do, is to broker a peace treaty between rivaling street factions where they pledge not to use violence against each other. Cure Violence has also been working to organize with families for disengaged parenting and opportunity youth. We also see that the Urban League of West Michigan has provided wraparound services to provide housing and economic security, which includes referrals to employment service and housing services. The Urban League has been a great partner in this work. On this next slide, you see the work around community-informed training. In the city's strategic plan, we've committed to elevating resident voice in all city operations. And in recent weeks, there's been a renewed request from community to be more involved in the creation and selection of training opportunities for police. We've heard that, especially from our immigrant and refugee communities, but across the city, we've heard concerns raised that community wants to be involved in this work. This budget reflects $100,000 of additional investment towards that development and implementation of public safety trainings. These trainings will be co-created with community and or responsive to community recommendations regarding necessary training for our public safety staff. That includes topics like cultural competency, understanding the immigrant and refugee experiences, bias reductions, impact on racism, and the history of policing in America. In addition to our work and training, we're also working to improve and increase our community engagement efforts. OPA continues to work with city departments and partners to increase engagement across the city regarding public safety policies. In recent weeks, we've worked with the Office of Equity and Engagement and community leaders, along with the office, the executive office, and the police department to begin to assess specific engagement needs for our refugee and immigrant community members. Amongst the needs identified, specific emphasis has been placed on Know Your Rights programming, specifically designed to address differences in legal expectations and cultural realities in the United States. And as some of you know, even at recent events that we attended, that was a theme that continued to come up. The community, there are differences in the way that policing expectations across the world. And it's important that our officers are trained on those differences. This budget reflects $150,000 in additional investment toward additional staffing and programming to increase engagement with our community, with a special emphasis on serving immigrant and refugee communities. On this next slide, there are some key performance indicators. You see that our CAB appeals cases and outcomes from 2020 and 2021. And if you look here, there were 56 cases that would have been eligible in 2020 and 48 that would have been eligible for CAB review in 2021. When we look at those 2020 cases, only 3 of the 56 were actually appealed. This speaks to the space where we're reimagining the Civilian Appeals Board and that we need to do additional work and making sure the community understands that this is a resource, how to utilize this resource, and to build trust in the resource. Another key indicator is around our expungement clinics. Again, we were able to service 500 at the city's expungement clinic, but OPA also assisted in other expungement clinics where 700 people were serviced. That brings us to a total of 1,200 people that have been served through our Clean Slate work. Horizon issues for the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability include the creation of an administrative policy that governs oversight to increase accountability. And this is a policy that will be understood by community to understand their roles and responsibilities, and also so that our internal staff, including our police officers, understand those roles fully. Increased access to police records continues to be a Horizon issue. The update of the Civilian Appeals Board policy, which we hope to do through the reimagining process, as well as work around racial healing circles to support community dialogue with police, to create cultural competency and build bridges to trust. Expanding capacity to provide permanent administrative support. We are excited about the ability to expand OPA's capacity now. We're grateful to the Kellogg Foundation for the support of 2 justice analysts, which will greatly help us increase that work. There's also an evaluation of traffic stop data. We are anticipate completing this by the end of fiscal year 2023. That's looking at that traffic stop data in a way that the city did previously to look for disparities in our traffic stops. And then also evaluation of officer-involved shooting policies and procedures. That includes, but is not limited to, when we publicly release video evidence, the identification of officers involved in incidents, de-escalation, and other relevant policies. Thank you.
All right, thank you, all 3 of you, appreciate it. I'll just start, one, thank you for the really comprehensive overview and all of the efforts happening right now. I have one question, then I'll turn to my colleagues. I'm curious, Mr. Davis, can you elaborate a little bit on maybe your thoughts on why the low number of appeals to CAB?
Sure. I think there are a few reasons that we're evaluating the low number of appeal to CAB. One of them is just it's a resource that not everyone knows about. So the police department does provide notice of CAB appeals as part of the CDR, the complaint disposition report that will go out to complainants that receive those reports, but not everyone understands what our CAB board does, and some of them, and there's a lack of trust for some as it relates to our Civilian Appeals Board. And that's one of the spaces and reasons that we're working through that reimagining process. Another space is the way that certain complaints are identified. And the chief and I have already begun to have some conversation around those spaces. But the ability to go to the Civilian Appeals Board is limited based on the type of complaint and the way that that complaint is classified. Additionally, the language in our current Civilian Appeals Board policy limits the ability to appeal to complainants, meaning the individual that was actually harmed in the incident, whereas we accept police complaints from anonymous sources. The way that our Civilian Appeals Board policy is currently written is not quite as expansive. So there's room for us to improve that policy to move toward more equitable outcomes and greater access by community.
Great. Thank you for that. And then just one other question. I'm happy to see the preliminary data related to cure violence. I know that data collection piece and tracking impact was a big part of the conversation we had when we started that program. Can you remind me how often this body will be updated on that work and the data from cure violence?
Sure. We are updating on an annual basis the data from Cure Violence. We began the work in July, so we anticipate having an update sometime around July or August.
Great, thank you. All right, colleagues, questions? Commissioner Moody?
Yep. Thank you very much for this report. I definitely appreciate it. I wanted to ask a question, well, two. One, in reference to the number of officers that you currently have right now versus 15 that are going to be leaving or they have left already. And in reference to that, are those officers, those 15 in decline, are they retired, or what is the essence of that number?
We just projected, based on historical data, that we lose about 10 officers a year to retirement. So we're trying to project out, if that's what you're referring to on that chart. That's projecting that we usually lose about 10 to retirement and 7 to other jobs or things of that nature. So it was just the projection of it.
Okay, my second question is that I have a pet peeve. My pet peeve is grow your own. And I've been talking about this since I got on this commission, about making sure that if we're going to look for officers, that we make sure we look in our backyard as well, starting with our schools. I don't know if you guys are looking at putting some kind of program together that will go into the Grand Rapids public school system to continue to put something in place to look for officers. And then two, you talked about training in reference to a comprehensive cultural training. I don't know what that looks like or what that is. Can you explain to me what that would be?
Sure, I'll talk about the schools. There is a program that's being put together through Grand Rapids Public Schools. It was put on hold for a little bit on their end, but I believe that they are continuing with it for all of public safety, not just police, but fire, dispatch, and everything, et cetera. And so that is still in the process of being created between our staff and theirs.
And additionally, other youth engagement we do have an Explorers program. We do have 3 officers assigned to the Boys and Girls Club in the city, as well a youth police academy. So we are making efforts there. In regards to training, part of the training as far as cultural competency will be something that Mr. Davis and I have talked about, getting input from the community, saying, what would you like to know? You know, we've had a lot of sit-downs with leaders from the immigrant community, refugee community from the Congo, and they've been telling us things, hey, we would like your officers to know this. So getting that input from the community to know what they want to know. Additionally, we have had mandatory implicit bias training over the past couple of years. It, from my initial assessment, it hasn't been as much as I would have liked to seen. We're sending in the month of June 2 officers out to Minnesota for a week-long train the trainer class for it's the Fair and Impartial Policing Institute, to come back so that we have individuals in the police department that are trained in implicit bias training, so they can come back and share their knowledge with us.
Got one more, Mayor. In reference to recruitment, you mentioned that you're going to be attending, or you're putting a plan in place for going to HBCU colleges. Have you already put that plan in place? Have you engaged with talking with individuals from the military and HBCU colleges, or even other police institutions in those particular communities about their policing practices?
Yes, the Community Engagement Unit, they have submitted actual plans for travel and have been in contact with the military bases and the HBCUs on who that they are visiting. There was some issues with some of the colleges not wanting to open up to have us actually on campus, so they were also trying to figure out how to do things virtually, but they are coordinating with all of the entities and have submitted actual plans and travel program, or how much travel is going to cost, et cetera, to go to these colleges.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
Mayor, the HBCU initiative has been one we have not been able to deploy in recent years due to the pandemic. Is that accurate?
Correct. Historically, we have visited some of the schools, but it took about a 2-year hiatus with COVID. Correct.
Thanks. Commissioner Repart?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Chief Winstrom. Thank you, Mr. Davis and DC Rogers. So kind of a broad question and then one nitpicky thing, but so I appreciate this budget as prepared now, but I guess I'm trying to kind of place it in the context of our situation. We're still waiting on a lot of information from this investigation. We're going to embark as a community on another deep look at policing in Grand Rapids, and so I appreciate from both you, Chief Winstrom, and you, Mr. Davis, and from the city manager that we're not going to leave any rock unturned, that any viable solution that we'll consider at this time. So I guess I have kind of two questions related to that. One is, how will I understand how you're going to be engaged, but how will the commission be engaged in those ongoing conversations around what are we going to do in the wake of this moment? And partly that's because I think that depending on what we decide to pursue, there's budget implications for that, right? So a silly example is, let's say that the community calls for GRPD to change their uniform. That would have a cost to the department for every single person to get a different uniform. Or if the community continues to offer their call for demilitarization and we decide that we want to have some shifts or some moments where officers are not carrying firearms anymore as a way of kind of eliminating that would have budget implications for liability insurance, for training, for purchase of those firearms. Or even, if we continue to kind of, it's all written down, we're going to do it, evaluate our balance of sworn versus non-sworn, that will have budget implications as we go along. So I guess my two questions are, how will we be engaged in our role as city commissioners in that ongoing debate? And then how will we return to budget conversations based on the outcome of that conversation? So that's my big question. I guess, forgive the nitpicky nature of this, but one of the calls from the community is for, an evaluation of kind of demilitarization. And so in the same line, we're going to go to historic Black colleges and universities and also to military bases. And so when I saw that, I thought to myself, that is a criticism of law enforcement, is kind of this kind of huge overlap with paramilitary folks, and just wondering what the discussions have been like about in the department around that. So, thank you.
I think that one of the driving factors in the visiting military bases is that generally speaking, that is an age group that is what we're targeting for recruits. As well, the diversity of the military is much greater than the general population and the general current makeup of the Grand Rapids Police Department. So that's a driving factor behind that.
Yeah. And Commissioner, I think I'll turn to City Manager to talk about process. I am with you. I do anticipate over the next several months and likely year, far beyond after we pass a budget for this year, that we likely will have budget implications to some of the things we want to accomplish. So City Manager, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think Commissioner Repart both posed the question and the answer in some of the response. So I think all the implications around fiscal decisions, you're right, this body will have to deliberate them, both as a body as a whole as well as fiscal committee. But the policy issues, I think the police chief indicated he'll be evaluating a lot of the policies. Those are operational within the police department. But as it affects the strategic plan, out of transparency, out of accountability, I fully expect both an update, as he's committed to both Public Safety Committee, his work, as well as Oversight Office work, and eventually a report out on the plan moving forward. And I think those are the big policy opportunities for the governing body to provide direction, feedback, but not operationally approve what he does in the police department, but definitely with resourcing that. I think the other opportunity is legislatively. As we have realized, a lot of the reform efforts that we have are local, but there's also the need to have this body's voice heard in Lansing and in DC. And that is something staff will supplement, will testify whenever we can, but I think now that we have the attention of the state and the country, that there'll be even more opportunities for us to be more visible and vocal around those issues as well. And then I think the other issue is when we get to what we know may be the legal challenges around litigation, as we've already been told that there is representation, that there will be policy discussions from this body that the city attorney will have to help us all with, and you will have to both deliberate those and decide on those moving forward. And so I because it is ever evolving, we will do our best to create a roadmap when those issues are, when those opportunities are. But I think if we can be disciplined to the Public Safety Committee process, and with the intent, if there's a desire for more people on this dais to be involved in that discussion, I don't think that there's anything that would prohibit other members from attending those meetings and participating in that process. Is that accurate, City Attorney?
Correct.
Okay, and so I would welcome that as a ongoing monthly opportunity to check in on progress in public safety.
Yeah, I think ultimately we recognize there's a lot of work before us, both by the chief and Mr. Davis, city manager, and all of us. And I don't think we can fully appreciate what lies ahead, but it's going to be a lot of work. Yeah, thanks. Let's go to Commissioner Lanier and then Commissioner Sassi, and then Commissioner Jones.
Good morning, Chief, DC, Mr. Davis. Thank you all so much for the presentation. Similar to Commissioner Reppert, I have my police department strategic plan here on the dais. I was, and multiple iterations of it actually too, in notes that I've been capturing in recent months, but even as the strategic plan was being developed. I was hopeful to have heard a little bit more about the strategic plan in this. I think the point that you made, Chief, about reevaluating at least one position probably, was part of kind of reviewing the strategic plan. But I think similar to Commissioner Reppert, I just feel like there are so many elements that are unknown that will impact this budget. And obviously, budgets are amended regularly, and so we know that that possibility, is likely. But just to kind of hear from you a little bit more about your thoughts on this strategic plan. It's, I think small enough to digest even within your short period of time of being in the city, despite, the challenges that you're faced with being here. So just curious a little bit about that. I, plan to spend time on your budget, and there have been a few line items over the years that I've had questions on that I know that I'll be reaching out to you just to get your feedback on those line items, because I want a better understanding of the interpretation of those line items. And I think it would be great for someone coming from externally to share feedback on those. And then I have a few. That's kind of my opening statement. And then I have a few just comments or questions. I do want to make the point that Drive for Success was funded by SAFE, and I think it's important to Commissioner Isasi's point about making sure that we're connecting all the dots that are tied together when we're making comments about programming. I think that's a really good one. I'd like to hear more, as Commissioner Moody was asking, about the process for the HBCUs. I know that many people in our community are alumni of HBCUs, and they're closely tied to their schools and institutions. And so if you're having challenges, breaking some of those barriers, I'm sure that those who are, closely connected to their institutions would be happy to help to connect you with alumni bodies and other other leaders within those institutions. Then I think the same question, Mary, that you had about IA, and I think to your point, Mr. Davis, that an awareness is part of the challenge. And I wonder if there could be an awareness campaign. But thank you for sharing that something about the structure of what can come to CAB is being a barrier, because that may speak to a lot. As I was looking at the IA complaints from last year to this one, they look pretty similar. So there's activity happening, regularly there. But I just wonder, how do we bring an awareness campaign to address the CAB process? And I think with the group that you're bringing together to talk through CAB and what it looks like and reimagining that, maybe that could come out of there. I think I'm curious to know what interactions and partnerships are we developing with agencies who are charged with providing services to the immigrant community, like Bethany, because, I think it would be great, again, to tie things together. We're doing work with a community of people that are also, hearing from another institution. It would be great to kind of know what's being shared there. And then you mentioned, I'm really happy, Mr. Davis, about the traffic stop study kind of review, and I'm hopeful that it will have the same data sets so that we can compare apples to apples. If my memory serves me correctly, I think we were using 2018 data when it was reviewed, because we had to go back a year at the time when it was being reviewed, or maybe it was 2017, and we were reviewing it in 2018. But I'm curious to know, if you will be able then to, whatever year that was, use all of the subsequent years in that report, because I think it'll tell a better story than from there to now looking at the data. And I think that concludes my questions, comments, statements.
Thanks. So I think I'll start with Chief to see if you can answer maybe a couple of the questions, obviously, where there were comments and questions intertwined. And then Mr. Davis, if you want to speak to anything.
To address the sort of strategic plan question, also Commissioner Repart and Commissioner Lanier, your concerns kind of on a broad basis about how the budget plays into this critical incident that's going to inform a lot of the decisions we're making moving forward. So policy is free to write. I mean, I can go into the system today and I can change policy, but in my view of how policy works to implement proper policy, there's the written words, the communication of those written words, and then there's training, especially for important policies like use of force, de-escalation, et cetera. And then there's one more factor, and that's accountability, making sure that officers are being held accountable to that policy and the training that they receive. So it brings comfort to me in this budget that knowing that we're going to be making these strong policy decisions and possibly major policy changes moving forward, that built into this budget is a framework for working with Mr. Davis and OPA with his increased budget for training for our officers, for him to make those proper decisions, to get the community input for training, for him to help decide what the sort of training that those officers need to comply with these policies, as well enhanced budget for accountability. And now that we're working together and taking a really serious look at the overall accountability system. So that brings comfort to me, knowing that as we look to changes across the system, that this budget seems to have built in, even though it was mostly created prior to the incident of April 4th, it seems like it's set up to put us in a position where we can succeed moving forward with these major changes. As for the strategic plan, while I was trying to picture in my eye, you're correct, Commissioner, I have only been here 54 days, but I did read the strategic plan before I got the job and looked at it since, and some of the high-level things I think that will be reflected. We spoke briefly about the correspondence model. We're doubling up the number of clinicians that are going to be available almost 24/7 to respond to calls that don't have that necessarily public safety or that danger aspect where you don't need an individual with a gun responding. Instead, we're going to have our partners for Network 180 actually dispatched there. The homeless outreach team is another example of that. Cultural competency training in the strategic plan is something that I know I am a big proponent of. I know Mr. Davis is too, and it's something that we're talking about. Transparency and accountability. I hope that the steps I've taken so far through this one high visibility thing shows my commitment to that. Can always do better. Can always evaluate doing better. I hope that that's the only police officer involved shooting that we ever have to deal with as a city moving forward. But I plan to release a transparency document to say that, should there be another high-level, high visibility incident like this, to be fully transparent, this is how we're going to handle it going forward. As Mr. Davis said, this is when we're going to release the name. This is when we're going to release the video. So to put it out there before the incident so people know what to expect in the process and they can have more faith in the process. De-escalation is mentioned in the strategic plan as well. Enhanced de-escalation training is something that I've already looked into getting and that I intend to get for the officers, as well as enhanced de-escalation policy. Data and transparency, I know we've been meeting about it. We have our public-facing dashboard is kind of in a holding pattern as we work through some data issues. I look forward to being as transparent about our crime data and things like that. And I will say, working with, when I started less than 2 months ago, one of the questions I had internally for the department was, hey, who's our liaison to cure violence? Because I want to talk to see how the process is going. And the answer was, we don't really do that yet. So that gave that was actually a benefit to me to immediately reach out to the Urban League and talk to Mr. Jackson, who's the director of Pure Violence, and say, hey, let's get this system in place. And I've already been sharing data with him, sending him Excel spreadsheets so that they have metrics that they can measure themselves against, as well as crime trends that I see. So starting that fresh from when I first walked in the door was very helpful for me to make sure that we succeed as a city, but their program succeeds as well. Those are the, off the top of my head, the strategic plan, high ticket items. I'm sure there's others that I'm missing, but they are all on my radar, Commissioner.
Thanks, Chief.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the things in the strategic plan is the staffing model. I think that's probably the one that it's relatively new, the way the staff is being deployed. So even if you don't have a response today, I'd like to hear your perspective on the existing staffing model and how people are deployed and when, and what we were trying to accomplish but not necessarily able to accomplish because of lack of staffing with the community-wide policing model.
And I have heard from a lot of, I've been in a community meeting just about every day, if not twice a day for the past month. And the input that I've received from a vast majority of the community is that they want to see the police officers. They want to see the police officers. They want to know the police officers by name. They want that community. They want that dedicated beat officer. They want good police officers. They want policing done as good as possible, but they want to see the police officers. So perhaps when I return next, I can give you an update on our staffing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. Mr. Davis, anything to add?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Commissioner, for your questions. As it relates to an awareness campaign around that reimagining cab, I agree. I think that we have to do work to make sure the community understands the resources that are available through our public safety functions and across the city, but especially as we're having these tough conversations in community about public safety, it's important that they understand those tools. And we've talked about doing that awareness campaign before. I thought it was important that we wait
wait to do an awareness campaign until after we do the reimagining process. So we're informing community about what the process is instead of about what the process was. So I look forward to doing that. We are still in a place where we are awaiting a few more of commission's appointments to that board so that we can begin that process. But our
Call
community
them out,
partner,
Brandon. Who hasn't given the next? No, I'm just kidding.
we are looking forward to beginning that process once we have the rest of those recommendations. As it relates to partners that we've been working with, yes, we've begun the work of working with community partners that work in those immigrant and refugee spaces. We're very grateful for the work of faith leaders who've come to the table and really given us a wealth of information and welcomed us to be a part of conversations to move forward. There's also presidents or leaders and different tribes throughout the the continent of Africa who are represented here in Grand Rapids. And we've begun conversations with many of them as well. We've also started working with Migrant Legal Aid, and they're a partner that we're working with in that Know Your Rights programming. So as you know, OPA already offers Know Your Rights programming, but we have not had a focus on immigration rights or those differences that exist from country to country. And Migrant Legal Aid is an early partner in that space. We're still working out the details, but they're an early partner that's come to the table willing to help us navigate that. So we are working through those partnerships. And with this added funding that's been recommended in this budget around that engagement space with immigrant and refugee communities, I anticipate capacity increasing greatly for us to be able to do more of that work. Lastly, as it relates to the traffic stop study, Commissioner, I will take all of that under advisement. We're really early in that process, so we haven't gotten to a point where we've determined the data sets, but I think the point you raised is a great point, and we'll make sure to look into that.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mr. Davis. And I'll turn to Commissioner Isasi and then Commissioner Jones.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all for being here and for the presentation today. I will hold some of my questions because some of my colleagues have brought up some things related to, and you did too, Chief Winstrom, about the crime data, and we talked extensively about CAB. But I wanted to just clarify one thing, DC Rogers, on the sworn force is, at this point, I just wanted to confirm, I know a couple of months ago when we had the resolution for Mercy Health to receive some officers, my understanding was that they would not go there until we reached our certain level. Is that the case?
Yes, that's correct. So none of those positions have been filled at this time.
I would say, colleagues, that continues to be an item for me, that as we do our post-evaluation, obviously the chief and his leaders and Mr. Davis are doing their evaluation on, policies review. I know, Chief, I believe you would have done that if you would have had that time. I know those were a number of things that we discussed very early on, but I think that's incumbent upon us to continue to look at resolutions and policies that we have control over this body. My concern is the privatization of our public safety services, as well as receiving other questions from other businesses and organizations who are asking for that same service. When we've heard from DC Rogers about the realities of the staffing and recruitment. So I think it's incumbent upon us to focus on what do we need to do internally. So I just have to continue to say that. I wanted to highlight the piece around the accreditation. I know this was a few months ago, before you were here, Chief, on the CALIA accreditation. I know, at least through social media and other people who had reached out, there were some concerns about the short notice to provide feedback as it related to the accreditation process. I don't know if we all remember that. So I think going back to when we overlay the community engagement, I don't know what that process is to be notified that individuals will do that in terms of that accreditation process, but that is one set of feedback I wanted to overlay with community engagement and expectations, because again, from the previous presentations, if the intention is to want to have that feedback, but you only get noticed a week ahead or a day before, how do we communicate that to the public? So that's one piece. I wanted to just highlight and thank Deputy Chief Reifenberg for bringing that Drive for Success program to the SAFE Task Force. I see you through the pieces. I think this is a good example of this task force and other sort of cross-sectional groups that we might have in the city, where we have somebody from our police department in leadership who knows some of the investments that are going on, as well as someone from our Kent County prosecutor, as well as other providers. And I just did also want to highlight one of our awardees, Puertas Abiertas, a program, and Chief, you got to meet some of the leaders there. Chief did meet with myself, Commissioner Lanier, DC Reifenberg, other individuals from the community. I think it was only about a week and a half before the incident involving Patrick Loyoya's death on the 4th. It was a great meeting because I think we were able to overlay experiences in neighborhood association groups, also those that are providing resources to those that may have experienced violence in our community. So to your point, Commissioner, continuing to overlay those investments is going to be absolutely important, as well as even in the expungement process. Mr. Davis, you and I talked about the hiring process for the city. So making that investment, and I know the HR department and you work together to be able to talk about also the opportunities that we have here at the city. So you talked about that life-changing moment, and then what does that lead out to? And then the last question I have is just continuing on the immigrant and refugee support and focus. I'll go back to my call for the county, because I think I'm glad to see us make that, commitment. And the reality is, I don't have that lived experience, and I don't want to speak for everybody else, but that's why I think the representation on these bodies and boards matter. But will we be continuing to go back to, I guess this is my one really question, will we go back? I know the welcome plan was referenced, which we received an update, I know many months ago, and some of us had even gone to other meetings. But knowing the investments that we'll make, but that was also work that was stood up with the county and other partners, do we know, are they going to also make subsequent investments to that? Because, we have been this community that has very openly worked to accept, refugees and immigrants, and I shouldn't say welcoming those into our community. But it's oftentimes, how do we bring people into community, but then how do they live every single day? So I just want to continue to say, it's not just, it is certainly us, and what is our responsibility, and what is not what responsibility, what is the humanity that we should be doing and changing how city government works. And I appreciate that, this quick response to it, but also how do we use that influence with other bodies who have led some of this work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
like
City
to
Manager, do you want
respond
to respond? Go ahead.
I share the concern about the pace and progress of the implementation of the welcome plan. And I did speak to the county administrator last week, who indicated to me that they were in the final stages of a hiring process to hire a full-time person. In light of that, I do think the moment requires us to lead where we can, and even if there has not been an opportunity, or even if the opportunity before was to do it collaboratively with the county, we will still do that. But I think specifically with police oversight and reform, to be more inclusive with the Oversight Office and the Police Chief's Advisory Team. But I recently acquired a list of some 18, 20 names of African immigrant refugees from the meeting that you were attended along with the mayor and myself this past weekend. And we intend to look at those names, share it also with the appointment committee, to see where there might be opportunities to be more inclusive on all areas of our public bodies, but also to see if we could have a more focused conversation in Grand Rapids, because I suspect the majority of people who are immigrant refugees, they all don't live in the city. They may have interactions working and other things, so we'll need it to be more inclusive around that. But I will also, as I committed to talk to the county administrator about broadband, we'll also see if we can get some actionable plans and commitments about their next steps around the welcoming plan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, City Manager. All right, Commissioner Jones and then Commissioner O'Connor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you to Chief Winstrom and Deputy Chief Rogers, Mr. Davis, for the presentation on this morning. I too had some of the very similar questions or concerns regarding the slide number 78 around recruitment processes with regards to not just obviously the HBCUs, but also the ability to go and try to attract potential officers from military bases. And so I thank you to my colleagues for bringing that up. Chief, I am also just, I'm happy to see, and much like I inquired earlier with the previous presentation, the absolute and critical need to review all of the departmental policies and procedures. What I'm asking is the same thing I'd be asking of the effort outside of police, is for every department to, in the very near future, as this review process occurs, is to have community members who would perhaps be willing to participate as well, just to provide an additional lens in reviewing those policies and procedures. So that would be my hope, that that's something that I'll be in communication with Ms. Stout about in her department, because again, I think it's critically important that we engage citizens in that space to, again, bring perhaps a lived experience that can speak to particular policies and procedures. Also, Chief, I too, as my colleague Commissioner Lanier mentioned, am very interested in hearing your feedback on deployment, in particular Hillett-Hines study. Again, I'll wait for that in the near future to hear from you on that. But also, if you could make note of, would love to hear from you in the near future about your experience in Chicago with CPD around the effort which we are seeing nationwide, where there's more of an effort to seek non-sworn civilian positions to engage in the work of public safety. And what was your experience there in Chicago in that work, or if you have any experience with that in Chicago? Also, to Mr. Davis, I can't thank you enough for the ongoing work of reimagining the Civilian Appeals Board. I get a myriad of questions around where the CAB is. I know that CAB has been a subject that many have discussed for a very long time, and really are I think for those who do know what CAB is, they're seeking to see a much more stable body that has a very clear-cut mission. And I'm happy to hear again about this, the ability to reimagine. And I think that the quicker we can reimagine, the better, especially in light of the current state. And I will make sure, in fact, please, if you could, maybe connect with Commissioner Yasasi, who heads up the committee around appointments, just so we can get an idea of, again, where we are. So whoever it is who's not Johnny on the spot, we can get on that and get some folks, get that particular body fully occupied by residents. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Commissioner. Let's go to Commissioner O'Connor, and then we'll see if Mr. Davis or Chief have any final comments before we move forward.
Thank you, Mayor. Coming back to the personnel stuff again, I've asked a lot of questions about this here and at Public Safety. As it relates, and I appreciate the effort and the work to understand we have a retirement curve that's happening because of a hiring boom in the 90s, and so there's a fairly large exodus of folks choosing to leave because they've reached retirement age, and maybe sometimes you could get people to stick around a little longer, but I think that's part of the strategy. Not the challenge, not just in our organization, but in both the public and private sector across the country is recruitment and retention of employees. So how do we, again, given the additional scrutiny that's on our department and on our community, how do we, we want the best and brightest no matter what job you do at the city of Grand Rapids, but ultimately at the police department, we absolutely want the best and brightest because of the critical nature of some of the interactions they have. So how do we strike that balance that, in an environment where there's lots of increased scrutiny on policing across the country, where we now have had a critical incident in our community, and we also want to make sure that we can be an attractive place for men and women who choose law enforcement as a career. How do we envision doing that? And then, as it relates to the curve now of we had a plan for 303, we're not going to get there, right? And we have a policing model that says we need 303 people to do the model with fidelity, and we're only covering 87% of the beats. So at what point do we have to make the determination, we're not getting to the level of staffing we need to implement the model with fidelity? When do we have to reimagine the model? And I mean, again, I know you're 60 days into the job, Chief, so and I know your team has done great work trying to figure that out along the way for the past several years, but I think there has to be a hard conversation at some point of, we may not get there. We may not get there as fast as we want to. I'm hopeful we get there, but how does that all work?
Those are both very difficult questions. The first one is kind of like, how are you going to fill these vacancies with what, the national climate of hiring, and now, to be blunt, this incident is not going to help us, especially not going to help us in our efforts to attract diverse candidates. So it's like 2 steps back. We had 10 recruits start, I want to say last week or the week before, last week, yesterday. And they all showed up, and we were just, this is, so I think I'm an optimist. I'm optimistic, and one of the reasons I am is because those individuals of the age that are considering this profession will look to the city, and they will see this critical incident, and they will see, how did the city react? Did they react in a way that treated their officers poorly, or did they react in a way that offered a fair process? And police officers want to work in a place where just like any other employee, they want good working conditions. And a lot of that's going to be how I respond internally to the officers. I've tried to be as transparent externally as possible. I've also tried to be as transparent internally as possible, meeting with the officers on a regular basis, letting them know that I understand what they're thinking and what their concerns are. So really, how we as a city respond is going to be the answer to how easily we can recruit people. And I'll tell you that so far, what I've seen, the present company especially has responded in a way that's seen as fair and legitimate within policing, so that I'm very optimistic that we will be able to meet these recruiting challenges moving forward and hit that number of 303. To the second question, you raise a very valid point, and if it becomes apparent that we can't hit that numbers, we will have to reimagine.
Thanks. And I know City Manager's making a list, and I know Mr. Davis and Chief is as well, so I anticipate some of the comments and questions being posed will come back at a later date with additional information, so just know that. Commissioner Lanier, and then I think I'll have the City Manager move on.
Yeah, I'll make this quick. I just want to come alongside the chief in his response, just to remind Commissioner O'Connor that part of the challenge with hiring was that the police department use the hiring freeze that was across the entire city, which I think at the time, I don't know why that decision was made, knowing that we have as many retirements. So I think some of being behind with hiring is actually attributed to the lack of recruitment efforts that should have taken place in the last 2 years.
Yeah,
as well.
That's a good point, and unfortunate. An unfortunate consequence of COVID and some of the unknowns at that time. So.
Right. I think, Mayor, just to be candid, we did not have any sight of relief at that time. So we knew we had significant reductions. We had no knowledge of what the CARES award would be locally. It was only being allocated to cities above certain populations, and the county did not provide an early indication of us receiving a lot of relief at the time. So that factored into the hiring freeze decision.
It's a good point. All right, so we will have you work with city manager to maybe create a update to the city commission on some of those questions that need a little bit more time. And thank you all again for your presentation today. Appreciate it. Thanks. All right, city manager, we have one more update, commissioners, on district court and the fire department. So we're going to ask those individuals to come forward. I know those of us who have to scoot out and have a hard stop, if those presenting, if you see any of us get up, please know it's not because we don't care about what you're saying, but it's because we have very busy schedules. So,
Thank you, Mayor. We're happy to have Chief Lehman and our Court Administrator Tanya Todd here with us this morning, and so we will start with the fire chief and then hear an update from the court.
I think it's is it district court first, and then fire chief? All right.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm Tanya Todd. I'm recently in this position, but before this, I was clerk of the court for 8 years. I will try to be a little bit speedy due to time. So just a comment on some of the things I was hearing about with the tracking. I thought it might be interesting to follow those stats to charges and outcomes maybe. And so reaching out to the court might be a good opportunity to have a thorough, comprehensive study on that. So we are the People's Court. About 2,500 people come to our courthouse daily, and that's for criminal cases, general civil, small claims, expungements, as we've hit on a lot. And so we are interacting with our citizens a lot. More than half of those people are for the district court. We do share the building with 17th Circuit Court. We don't really talk about the weddings that we do, but that's a happy time for us. So Friday afternoons, every now and then you hear some cheering going on, and that's rare, so we welcome that. We do have our specialty courts, a sobriety court and a drug court, and there will be a slide that will show the recidivism rates and that success. You will also be getting an invitation to our May 25th drug court luncheon, because May is drug court month, and we want to celebrate some of our graduates and explain to you what the program has to offer. You've also probably seen our work crew program in the community, cleaning up, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, and that's a benefit for the city because it allows the purchases to be at better prices. Also, I see Ms. Bohatch in here. We worked together on the eviction prevention program, and that was for 3 years, and I believe the city has allowed that to continue even after the grant funds ended. And I'll mention it again a little bit later, but just at the end of March, beginning of April, we received a $310,000 grant for another eviction diversion to hire 2 facilitators for 1.5 years to work directly with tenants in more of a social work capacity to find out their barriers to paying rent, rather than just giving out the funds like the recent SARA funds have been doing.
That's great.
So we've had this conversation about, revenue, and I don't even like calling it revenue because I feel like we're providing a service to the citizens of Grand Rapids. The pandemic was difficult. We did do the unemployment share. I think we were one of the only organizations to do that to try to alleviate some of our, I don't like to say burden because I think we're an asset, but there is some good news. I do think there is some momentum in the state as it pertains to trial court funding. They created a Michigan Judicial Council in April 21, and their first strategic goals is to address trial court funding. So this isn't just an us problem, this is an across the state problem, and it's nice to see that the state is considering that. And even though it didn't pass, Governor Whitmer did put in a $175 million line item to get all courts on the same database. And so it just leads me to believe that there's discussion about the funding issues. Typically, and I'll leave you to read the stats, but there was a study done and we are in line as far as employees go with how we are staffed. And even though our revenue is down, and I know this has been addressed, we can have all the tickets or not all the tickets we want, but we've had a lot of things added. There's been a lot of discussion about expungements. We don't receive anything. We're providing the record checks for all these expungement fairs that are going on. And during the pandemic, we had to add an additional landlord-tenant hearing, so that takes up docket time and staff time. We have, as of April 1st, we can't provide date of birth because it's protected identifying information. So now we have 100 record checks per day that come from record check companies. So even though the revenue side looks dire, we're doing a lot of work for the community. Just a quick note on the recidivism rate, you'll see that the program participants, and then especially the graduates, have excellent rates of not reconvicting. So that's just a significant benefit to the community. And again, I encourage you to attend the luncheon on May 25th to learn more about that. We're also committed to DEI, and we like to take advantage of any trainings that Ms. Stout has to offer, but we did start our own group. We have a DEI meeting the fourth Wednesday of each month. We started out with about 5 employees. Now that's grown to close to 20, and we are going to be having some DEI speakers at June 8th and having the court attend, Dr. Tanya Bailey, and also a representative from the Michigan Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services, and we continue to work on landlord-tenant issues as well. Sorry, I'm going fast. There's been a lot of decriminalization work, as mentioned, the clean slate legislation. In a couple of years, we're going to have to be working right now where to build into our case management system, there's an automatic expungement where certain charges after 7 or 5 years are automatically expunged. So hopefully that'll save time for staff because you won't have to go through the process of filing the motion and getting the hearing and all of that. So there's also been a lot of decriminalization of misdemeanors to civil infractions. And you can see the other types of things that have been going on in the criminal justice field. And with all those expungements, like I say, we try our best to help out with the record checks and the record checks for the employment agencies as well. I mentioned the strategic goal and some movement in trial court funding. We're completing the sale of 2 courtrooms back to the county, so that was going to help us with our budget. I'm also looking into other areas of the courthouse that we're not using anymore to hopefully help with the lease. We did get in November, or receive in November, a grant for $160,000, and that's going to allow for the payment of an outdoor payment kiosk to hopefully get better access to people who need to make payments. Also, a large case management system for our bench to transition into more e-filing and some future trends. We also use that for some PPE and overtime work to catch up on the backlog. Again, mentioning our work crew program and some of the things I've already mentioned. We also are nationally recognized as being part of a nationwide cohort that we discuss the landlord-tenant housing issues and eviction issues. And with that grant, I did want to mention that recent one at the beginning of April for $310,000. I don't know how many applicants there were total, but it was whittled down to 25, and then we went through an interview process, and we're one of 13 cities nationwide to embark on this new grant. And so just in closing, I heard a lot of key words up here through this morning. Essential services, we did not close to the pandemic. The wheels of justice had to continue to turn. I've heard know your rights, and talking about that, that's the court. Housing, expungements, diversion, interpreters. By court rule almost 10 years ago, we have to provide interpreters, and we have a robust program. So a lot of what we talked about today has a direct tie-in with us, and we like to see our justice system supported. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that update. Chief?
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing us to present today. I'm happy to be able to wrap up our budget discussions today with the first slide here that represents our rededication of our Martin Luther King Fire Station on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. We're happy to be able to do that. I'd like to provide some other overviews that are included in this budget. We just are concluding a hiring of our class of 15, and in January we hired those folks due to be completed in September. Increased our firefighter of color by 66% in comparison with 2018, in which 10% of all staffing are now people of color. By September of '22, we expect to be at our full authorized strength in our hiring authorized strength of 2006. And then we are working with HR to build out our fire cadet program, which we are very excited that was budgeted for this year. That will give us the ability to intentionally seek more diversity within our ranks. The GRFD was reaccredited this year with the CPSE, the Fire Commission on Accreditation, as well as working on our next strategic plan. We're in the very end stages of that, and it's almost ready for city manager review shortly. We were submitted for a SAFER grant, which would add 8 personnel to help bolster our strength in the south end of town, where we're experiencing some gaps. And we will speak about that in a couple of more slides. But we also continue to collaborate with GRCC on a couple fronts. One is with the Associate's Degree Program, but also with a proposed new training facility that could be in the future. This slide represents our budget overview, just shy of $36 million. You can see that a majority of our personnel costs at 83%, leaving 12% in other services. And this is a very tight budget for us as we continue in our many years of a continuation budget. The breakdown of this budget right here shows an increase in our budget in a personnel line item, but those are mainly due to contractual increases in wages and health insurance, and that makes up a majority of that increase. In this proposed personnel costs, we can see that the breakdown there. I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I will show you that in this slide here that represents the 12% of our additional costs, that equipment rentals makes up a majority of that. That is our large vehicle fleet, and we have very little in the way of discretionary that's left in this budget. You can see that in this breakdown here by program that, of course, our fire suppression staff make up the majority of that. And then speaking to our strategic plan update, we do hit a lot of areas here within government excellence as well as emergency preparedness. We are planning for a full-scale high-rise exercise in June of this year, and we are also increasing our recruitment efforts and working with our HR department as well as a robust recruiting team to help bolster that for ourselves. The HOT team continues to work tirelessly at addressing the needs of our unsheltered community. This slide represents not only their metrics, but over 8,000 engagements in that period of time of 21. Our Office of Emergency Management, I can't even begin to understand what we would do if we did not have that office.
Can you advance the slides, Chief?
Sorry.
Thanks.
I can't even imagine what we would do without the Office of Emergency Management supporting us throughout all of our efforts over the last number of years. In that office, they have been and they will continue to work on not only our COOP planning, continuity of operations planning for the entire city, helping to facilitate tabletop exercises, as well as coordinating the creation of our emergency hazard mitigation plan. That was in coordination with Kent County and Ottawa County, but continuing to work on a regional mitigation plan as well as our emergency operations plan. This slide represents our key performance indicators. Again, distribution, concentration, and reliability are the things that we depend on to gauge ourselves. You can see a dip in the orange line, which represents distribution starting in 2019. Again, that represents our ability to get the first unit on scene within that benchmark time, and we do suffer some areas on the periphery of the city to be able to make that happen. We are working on how we can adjust for that. Some horizon issues that we see, they revolve around our ability to create and maintain our aging facilities, and the Division Fire Station, which you've heard me talk about before. We have acquired land, and we have $1 million budgeted in fiscal year '24 for site prep and demolition. Fiscal year '25, we'll see a bond issue, and then this facility will assist with the replacement of Station 10, along with taking on some of the training components that we see from Cold Brook, as well as being able to provide an emergency operations center for that facility as well. So wrapping a number of different needs into one facility will be tight, but we will be able to make that work within the bounds of what we're able to be given. We also have a conversation going on in the community about the GRCC training site. That site right now is still in the planning phases, but will assist us in being able to make up some of the gaps that we would have in our training components. But it's important for you to understand that a remote training site outside of the city, depending on where it's located, will not meet all of our needs, and we still need to concentrate on training within the city and how we can best accomplish that. Some other things that I want to emphasize is the cadet program. That would allow us to hire up to 6 personnel, and we would target the high school graduates just out of high school, and they would be able to give us some assistance with logistics within the fire department, as well as providing a career opportunity and a career pathway for those people within the department. And I would like to conclude my presentation there, and ready for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief and Ms. Todd. I'll go ahead and open up and see if colleagues have any questions for either Ms. Todd or Chief Lehman.
Commissioner, I have one.
Well, go ahead, Commissioner Moody.
My question is for the 61st District Court. You said that you received a grant for over $300,000 in assistance to eviction division. Do you know what the process is for people who are being evicted? How do they apply for this $300,000?
So this is going to be for 2 facilitators over 1.5 years, and it's a new program, so it's in the works. But what we're going to do is we work with MDHHS as well, so we can cross-reference data. And our goal is to connect with each tenant. So once the landlord-tenant case is filed, to connect with each tenant and try to screen them and connect them to community resources. So if there's addiction problems or transportation problems or childcare problems, we want to take what Kent County has in the city of Grand Rapids and use those resources and just act as the pivot point for people. Because unfortunately, all of our evaluations and studies in landlord-tenant, you want to catch the people before the case is filed, but we haven't quite figured out how to do that. And so the court is just a finite point where we know someone's in need, and so then we want to just utilize that advantage.
So is it possible to try to figure out some type of advertisement through
Oh,
the
absolutely,
city?
yes, absolutely. And so this is a work in progress. We're just, my administrative assistant is trying to figure out the budget, and then we're going to try to post within this month. So marketing would be great. The only thing I would asterisks on this is that it's a private donor, and they have not yet publicly made their announcement. So they asked to hold off on any marketing until in May they make their announcement, and I don't know who it is.
Yes, Commissioner O'Connor.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Again, for the court, remind me, I believe there was some bond payments that were pretty well done paying off the courthouse. Is that, when does that happen, and what was the revenue number that's going to be saved once that was paid? I know it's happening in the next year or two.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to give a incorrect statement, but I want to say hundreds of thousands at least. We're doing it right now. So we are arming the courtroom 1A, which is smaller, so we had to get it up to security speeds, but the magistrate is moving from 7B to 1A so that we could give the county a whole judicial suite. And so right now Judge Buda retired, and Judge Ross moved to 7A, but she'll be shifted. Anyways, we're doing the shift by summer. And then I'm hoping to also get some space back from space we used for DART.
Very good.
I was going to say, I can jump in real quick and help you.
Thank you, Mel.
Just, no problem. I know with the courtroom shift, we were banking on at least about $500,000 just with that move, but we can follow up as far as the actual bond payment, where we are at there. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can follow up.
Thank you for not either knowing that off the top of your head. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, Commissioner Lanier.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Just a quick question for you, Chief, regarding the acquisition for the South Fire Station. Do you have a timeline for acquiring and possibly opening a fire station further south?
So that we are currently working on a location, and we've had some good communications with a couple different locations that we feel would be very acceptable. And it's a matter of finalizing those to be able to have that spot, and then to look at site development and those conversations. There has been some money budgeted in out years and the capital fund to be able to do that work. And so I'm hopeful, as long as the funding streams continue, that we'll be able to make good progress on that.
Thank you. So then there was another slide that mentioned something about staffing, slide 106. So does this 8 personnel here, does that occur, sooner than later? It looks like this is just kind of tied to the program where we're going into homes and things of that nature.
So that number is tied to a SAFER grant, and the SAFER grant, unlike the police grants that get brought forward, is a very competitive grant process. And so if we're successful in that grant process, we should know by September. And if that's the case, then we would be able to start that hiring process. And that will take, with our new way of working within HR, that should be a shortened process. So we're expecting about 3 months. So hopefully by the first of the year of '23.
Can I add, Commissioner, and just to clarify, so unlike the COPS grant where there's no requisite match for the SAFER grant, and unlike the COPS grant, there's not a requirement to maintain staffing levels at the end of the grant period. So should it not be fiscally sustainable, the chief is committed that he could absorb the positions with natural turnover within the department if we're unable to sustain. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Because I don't think our 5x5 projects any addition of the firefighters in out years. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Yep. Commissioner Repart.
Yeah, thank you. Just for the court, just thanks for your work with the drug court, the sobriety court, the eviction work. That's all so super important. Very much in support of your work around decriminalization as well. And I just think that's another wonderful opportunity to partner with our police department as we evaluate those things in the future. Commissioner Yasasi had one question for the chief before she left, is the homeless outreach team's interaction with the FUSE program. Just as that's kind of relaunched again, making sure that information is flowing between those two, if you had an update to share about that.
Yeah, most definitely. So Tammy Britton sits very closely tied between those two programs, as well as Ms. Bohach, and our ability to have our EMS person intertwined. So we have very good connection and cross-connection within all those programs.
Chief Lehman.
Hey, thanks for letting us use the place on South Division for our CAA meetings. There's a big sledgehammer thing in there. I gave it a whirl last time we had our meeting last Thursday.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chief, Ms. Todd, for the presentations this morning. I'll turn now to City Manager for the wrap-up and next steps.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. I'm going to ask Chief if he could advance the slides for me to the other way. Yes. So thank you for your time this morning and questions. We will endeavor to follow up with responses either that relate to the future sections or separate if they are relating to questions about equity, financials. And we have a scheduled work session next on the 10th to discuss what you see before you, both in the morning and the afternoon. And if you can advance to the next slide, please. And so just to remind you about the process, please submit your questions to me and the CFO so we can ensure continuity, because as you can imagine that there are multiple people that sometimes are required to work on coordinate responses, and we want to make sure it's as coordinated as possible. And since we have a lot of people doing a lot of things in the organizations, and we'll try to get those responses out to you before the next work session. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. Colleagues, we have two resolutions that we need to speak to on this afternoon before our public comment opportunity. The first is a resolution scheduling a public hearing on Tuesday, May 17, 2022 on the proposed property taxes and fiscal year 2023 city budget.
So moved. Support.
It's been moved and supported. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good. Motion carries. Next item is resolution scheduling a public hearing on Tuesday, May 17, 2022 to consider fiscal year 2023 service provision fees.
Moved.
Support.
It's been moved and supported. Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good. Motion carries. And now we'll move to public comment. I'd like to provide that opportunity for anyone who is here. Please step up to the microphone. You have up to 3 minutes to provide public comment. Are there any takers? No? Okay, very good. Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.